The wind howled through the mountain pass like a living thing, carrying with it the scent of snow and something else, something darker. Martha Johnson pressed herself against the rough bark of the pine tree, her breath coming in sharp, visible puffs as she watched the three men approach Henry Adams' cabin. Their voices carried on the bitter air, harsh and full of malice. "Should have minded his own business," one of them snarled, his hand resting on the rifle at his side. "Nobody asked him to interfere with our claims." Henry stood in his doorway, tall and unwavering despite the odds against him. His broad shoulders filled the frame, and even from her hiding place among the trees, Martha could see the steady set of his jaw. He had known they would come. They all had. "You're on my land," Henry's voice carried clear and strong across the clearing. "And you'll leave the same way you came, or not at all." The leader of the three men laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. "Your land, mountain man? You've got more grit than sense. But that won't save you tonight." Martha's heart hammered against her ribs. She had come here to warn him, racing through the treacherous mountain paths as darkness fell, but she was too late. The confrontation she had feared was already beginning, and the man who had shown her nothing but kindness was facing it alone. But Henry Adams was not the kind of man to back down, not when he was protecting something precious. And Martha Johnson, despite everything she had lost, despite all the reasons she had to stay hidden and safe, found herself stepping out from behind the tree. "He's not alone," she called out, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. The three men turned toward her, surprise flickering across their faces. Henry's eyes found hers across the clearing, and in them she saw something that made her chest tighten with emotion, a look that said he understood what her presence here meant, what it cost her to stand beside him. "Ma'am, you'd best get yourself back to town," the leader said, his tone dismissive but wary. "This doesn't concern you." Martha stepped forward, closer to Henry's side, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his large frame. "It concerns me plenty," she said, lifting her chin with a dignity that surprised even herself. "This man has done nothing but help folks in need. If you have a problem with that, you have a problem with me too." The moment stretched between them, tense and electric with possibility. This was the culmination of everything that had brought them together, every small kindness, every moment of understanding, every barrier that had slowly crumbled between the mountain man everyone feared and the widow everyone pitied. But to understand how Martha Johnson came to be standing in that clearing, willing to risk everything for a man the entire town had warned her against, we must go back to the beginning, to a cold morning in late autumn when desperation had driven her to the very edge of the wilderness, and to the door of the one person no decent woman was supposed to visit. The morning Martha Johnson first climbed the winding mountain path to Henry Adams' cabin, frost clung to every blade of grass, and her breath formed small clouds in the crisp air. Her worn boots slipped on the rocky trail, and more than once she had to steady herself against a tree, her hands already numb despite her thin gloves. The weight of her situation pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden, heavier than the small bundle of belongings she carried. 3 months had passed since Thomas died, 3 months since the fever took him, and left her alone in a world that seemed to have no place for a woman without a husband's protection. The other wives in town had been kind enough at first, bringing casseroles and offering gentle words of comfort. But kindness had its limits, especially when it came to practical matters like paying rent and keeping food on the table. "You could always remarry," Mrs. Williams had suggested just the week before, her tone carefully neutral as they stood together after church services. "There are several good men in town who might consider taking on a widow, especially one still young enough to bear children." The suggestion had made Martha's stomach turn, not because she was opposed to marriage in principle, but because she knew what kind of arrangements Mrs. Williams meant. Marriages of convenience, where a woman traded her freedom and dignity for basic survival. She had seen such unions before, had watched the light fade from women's eyes as they settled into lives that were little more than servitude. "I can manage on my own," Martha had replied, though even as she spoke the words, she knew they weren't entirely true. Her small savings were nearly depleted, and the seamstress work she had been taking on wasn't enough to cover her basic needs. Now, as she climbed higher into the mountains, Following directions she had overheard in hushed conversations at the general store, Martha wondered if she was making a terrible mistake. Everyone in town had stories about Henry Adams, the mountain man who lived in isolation above the tree line. Some said he was dangerous, a man who had turned his back on civilized society for dark reasons. Others whispered that he was simply strange, too rough and wild to live among decent people. But there were other stories too, quieter ones that people shared reluctantly, almost against their better judgment. Stories of travelers who had been caught in sudden storms and found shelter at his cabin. Tales of injured animals he had nursed back to health. Of supplies that mysteriously appeared on the doorsteps of struggling families during the harshest winter months. It was one of these stories that had given Martha the courage to make this journey. Mrs. Patterson, the baker's wife, had mentioned in passing that Henry Adams occasionally traded fresh game for other supplies, and that he always dealt fairly, never trying to cheat or take advantage. "He's not like what people say," Mrs. Patterson had added quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "Rough around the edges, certainly, but honest. More honest than some men who sit in church every Sunday, if you ask me." Martha hadn't asked, but she had filed the information away, and now with her options dwindling, she found herself acting on it. The path grew steeper as she climbed, and the trees pressed closer together, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the morning sunlight into dappled patterns on the ground. The air was thinner here, and Martha had to stop several times to catch her breath. Each pause gave her time to think, to question what she was doing, to imagine the scandalized expressions on the faces of the town's proper ladies if they knew where she was heading. But desperation had a way of making decisions easier. Martha had exactly $12 to her name, enough to last perhaps another month if she was very careful. After that, her choices would be even more limited. She could throw herself on the mercy of relatives who had made it clear they considered her husband's death an inconvenience. Or she could accept one of the marriage proposals that had been delicately suggested. Unions that would provide security at the cost of everything else that mattered to her. Or she could try something different, something that might allow her to maintain her independence while earning an honest living. The idea had come to her gradually, pieced together from fragments of overheard conversations and her own observations of what the mountain communities needed. There were families scattered throughout the higher elevations, people who lived too far from town to make regular trips for supplies, but who had goods to trade. Someone who could serve as a go-between, carrying messages and facilitating trades, could make a modest living while providing a valuable service. It wasn't a conventional occupation for a woman, certainly, but Martha had never been entirely conventional. Thomas had often teased her about her independent streak, her tendency to question accepted wisdom and find her own solutions to problems. It was one of the things he had loved about her, he said, though she suspected it was also one of the things that had made some of the other wives view her with suspicion. Now, as she approached what she hoped was Henry Adams' cabin, Martha tried to summon that independent spirit. She would present her proposal clearly and professionally. She would demonstrate that she was serious about this venture, not some desperate widow looking for charity. And if he turned her away, she would find another path forward, because giving up simply wasn't an option. The cabin appeared suddenly through the trees, larger than she had expected, and built with obvious skill and care. The logs were perfectly fitted, chinked with what looked like fresh mortar, and the roof showed no signs of wear or neglect. Smoke rose from the chimney in a steady stream, and she could see a well-tended garden plot to one side, though most of the plants had been harvested for the winter. Martha paused at the edge of the clearing, suddenly uncertain. Now that she was here, the magnitude of what she was attempting seemed overwhelming. She was about to approach a man she had never met, a man with a reputation that ranged from mysterious to dangerous, and propose a business arrangement that most people would consider highly inappropriate. Before she could lose her nerve entirely, the cabin door opened. Henry Adams was larger than she had expected, tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair that showed traces of gray at the temples. His clothes were simple but well-made, practical garments designed for life in the wilderness. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, dark brown and intelligent, studying her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Ma'am," he said, his voice deep and carefully modulated, "you're a long way from town." Martha straightened her shoulders and stepped forward, trying to project more confidence than she felt. Mr. Adams, I'm Martha Johnson. I was hoping I might speak with you about a business proposition. Something flickered across his expression, too quick for her to interpret. He glanced past her, as if checking to see if she had come alone, then stepped back from the doorway. You'd better come inside, he said. It's cold enough out there to freeze a person solid. The interior of the cabin was warm and surprisingly comfortable. A fire crackled in a stone fireplace, and the furniture, though simple, was well crafted and arranged with care. Books lined one wall, more books than Martha would have expected to find in a mountain cabin, and she could see a desk in one corner covered with what looked like correspondence. Sit, Henry said, gesturing toward a chair near the fire. I'll put some coffee on. Martha accepted the offer gratefully, settling into the chair and extending her hands toward the warmth. She watched as Henry moved around the small kitchen area with efficient, practiced movements. Everything about his home spoke of a man who had chosen his isolation deliberately, not someone who had been driven to it by circumstances beyond his control. Now then, he said, settling into the chair across from her with two steaming mugs. What's this business proposition you mentioned? Martha accepted the coffee gratefully, using the moment to organize her thoughts. I understand you occasionally trade with people in town and with families living in the higher elevations. Henry nodded slowly. From time to time. I was thinking there might be an opportunity for someone to serve as a regular go-between, Martha continued, warming to her subject despite her nervousness. Someone who could carry messages, facilitate trades, help connect people who have goods to exchange, but don't have the time or ability to make the journey themselves. Henry's expression remained neutral, but she could see him considering her words. That's dangerous work, he said finally. The mountain trails aren't forgiving, especially in winter, and some of the people living up here, they value their privacy. They don't take kindly to strangers. I understand the risks, Martha replied, though she suspected she only understood a fraction of them. But I'm a good rider, and I learn quickly. I think I could provide a valuable service while earning an honest living. And what makes you think you need to earn a living at all? Henry asked, his tone carefully neutral. Most women in your situation would be looking for a husband to provide for them. The question stung, partly because it echoed her own doubts. Most women in my situation don't have a choice, she said, lifting her chin. I do. At least, I hope I do. Henry studied her for a long moment, and Martha had the unsettling feeling that he was seeing more than she intended to reveal. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. There are 3 families living up on the North Ridge, he said slowly. The Millers, the Johnsons, and the Kellys. They're good people, but they're too far from town to make regular trips for supplies. They usually wait until someone like me is heading down anyway, but that's not always convenient for anyone involved. Martha felt a flutter of hope. Would they be interested in having someone make regular runs? Maybe, Henry said, but they'd need to trust that person completely. They'd be depending on them for everything from medicine to mail. One mistake, one broken promise, and people could die. The weight of responsibility he was describing should have intimidated her, but instead Martha found it oddly reassuring. This was exactly the kind of meaningful work she had been hoping for, something that would allow her to feel useful while maintaining her independence. I understand, she said. How would I go about meeting them? Proving that I'm reliable. Henry was quiet for so long that Martha began to wonder if she had overstepped somehow. When he finally spoke, his words surprised her. I could take you up there, he said. Introduce you. Let them see for themselves what kind of person you are. But I'd want to know more about you first, about why you're really doing this. The question was fair, but answering it would require revealing more about her circumstances than she was comfortable sharing. Still, if she wanted his help, she would need to be honest. My husband died 3 months ago, she began, her voice steady despite the familiar ache the words brought. Thomas was a good man, but he wasn't much for saving money. When the fever took him, I was left with very little. The other wives in town have been kind, but charity has its limits. I need to find a way to support myself, and this seems like something I could do well. Henry nodded slowly. I'm sorry for your loss, he said, and something in his tone made her believe he truly meant it. But there's more to it than that, isn't there? You could find work in town, or remarry like most widows do. Why choose something this difficult and dangerous? Martha set down her coffee mug and looked directly at him. Because I want to choose, she said simply. For the first time in my life, I want to make decisions based on what I think is right, not what other people expect of me. Does that make sense? Something shifted in Henry's expression, a recognition that made her think he understood exactly what she meant. It makes perfect sense, he said quietly. More sense than most people would give you credit for. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the fire crackling between them. Martha found herself studying Henry's face, trying to reconcile the man sitting across from her with the stories she had heard in town. There was nothing threatening about him, nothing that suggested the dangerous wildness people whispered about. If anything, he seemed thoughtful and deliberate, someone who chose his words carefully and meant what he said. The family's on the North Ridge, she said finally. When could we visit them? Henry smiled slightly, the first genuine smile she had seen from him. Eager, aren't you? I prefer to think of it as determined, Martha replied, and was pleased when his smile widened. We could go tomorrow if the weather holds, he said. But I should warn you, it's a full day's ride and the trail isn't easy. You'll need warm clothes and a good horse. I have both, Martha said, though she wasn't entirely certain about the horse. The mare she had borrowed for the trip up to his cabin was gentle enough, but she wasn't sure how the animal would handle more challenging terrain. Henry seemed to read her uncertainty. I've got a mare that would suit you better, he said. Steady on mountain trails and used to carrying supplies. You're welcome to use her. The offer was generous, more generous than Martha had any right to expect from a virtual stranger. That's very kind of you, she said, but I should pay you something for the use of the horse and for your time in making the introductions. Henry waved off her concern. Let's see how tomorrow goes first, he said. If the families are interested in your services, we can work out the details then. Martha finished her coffee and stood, recognizing that the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. I should head back to town before it gets too late, she said. What time should I be here tomorrow? Early, Henry said, rising as well. Dawn, if you can manage it. We'll want to reach the first cabin while there's still plenty of daylight. Martha nodded and moved toward the door, then paused. Mr. Adams, may I ask you something? Henry, he corrected gently. And yes, you may. Why are you willing to help me? You don't know anything about me, and from what I understand, you prefer to keep to yourself. Henry was quiet for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. Maybe because I know what it's like to want to make your own choices, he said finally. And maybe because I think you're brave enough to succeed at this, even if you don't know it yet. The compliment warmed her more than the coffee had, and Martha found herself smiling as she stepped out into the cold mountain air. Thank you, she said. I'll see you at dawn. The ride back to town passed more quickly than the journey up had, partly because the trail was easier to navigate downhill, but mostly because Martha's mind was occupied with plans and possibilities. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt genuinely hopeful about the future. The sun was setting by the time she reached the outskirts of town, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the snow-capped peaks. Martha returned the borrowed horse to the stable and walked slowly toward her small rented room, savoring the feeling of anticipation that had replaced the desperation she had carried with her that morning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, she knew. The mountain families Henry had mentioned might not be interested in her services, or they might find her unsuitable for reasons she couldn't anticipate. But for the first time in months, she felt like she was moving forward rather than simply struggling to survive. As she prepared for bed that night, Martha found herself thinking about Henry Adams and the quiet kindness he had shown her. The man she had met bore no resemblance to the dangerous, recluse people whispered about in town. Instead, he had been thoughtful and generous, offering help without expecting anything in return. Perhaps, she thought as she drifted off to sleep, the people of the town were wrong about more things than just Henry Adams. Perhaps there were possibilities in this mountain country that she had never considered, opportunities for a different kind of life than the one she had always assumed she would live. Dawn came earlier than Martha would have liked, but she was awake and dressed before the first light appeared over the mountains. She had packed carefully the night before, choosing her warmest clothes and most practical boots. The small bundle of supplies she carried included jerky, dried fruit, and a water bottle. Provisions for what Henry had warned would be a long day. Henry was waiting for her when she arrived at his cabin, 2 horses saddled and ready. The mare he had offered her was a sturdy bay with intelligent eyes and a calm demeanor that immediately put Martha at ease. "Her name is Sage," Henry said, handing Martha the reins. "She's been up and down these trails more times than I can count. She'll take good care of you." Martha stroked the mare's neck, pleased when Sage nuzzled her hand gently. "She's beautiful," she said. "Are you sure you don't mind me using her?" "I'm sure," Henry replied, swinging up onto his own horse, a large black gelding that seemed to match his owner's quiet strength. "Ready?" The trail to the North Ridge was everything Henry had warned her it would be and more. It wound through dense forest, across rocky streams, and up steep inclines that made Martha grateful for Sage's sure footing. But it was also breathtakingly beautiful, with views of distant peaks and valleys that made her feel as though she was seeing the world from an entirely new perspective. Henry proved to be an excellent guide, pointing out landmarks and potential hazards with the casual expertise of someone who knew every inch of the terrain. He also proved to be surprisingly good company, sharing stories about the wildlife they encountered and the history of the various settlements they passed. "That's where the old mining camp used to be," he said, pointing to a clearing where only foundation stones remained. "Played out about 5 years ago, and the families moved on to find work elsewhere. But for a while it was a thriving little community." "Do you miss it?" Martha asked. "Having neighbors closer by?" Henry considered the question as they rode. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I chose this life for good reasons. The solitude suits me, and I like being able to help people on my own terms, without having to worry about what the community thinks is proper or appropriate." Martha understood exactly what he meant. "In town, people have very definite ideas about how a widow should behave," she said. "What she should want, how she should spend her time. Sometimes I feel like I'm disappointing everyone just by existing." "Their disappointment says more about them than it does about you," Henry replied, his tone matter-of-fact. "People are often uncomfortable with anyone who doesn't fit neatly into their expectations." The observation was astute, and Martha found herself wondering about Henry's own story, about what had brought him to choose this isolated life. But she sensed that such questions would need to wait until they knew each other better. The first cabin they visited belonged to the Miller family, a couple in their 40s with 3 children ranging in age from 8 to 16. They welcomed Henry warmly and regarded Martha with polite curiosity as he explained her proposal. "It would be convenient," Mrs. Miller admitted after hearing Martha out, "especially during the winter months when the trails are more treacherous. But we'd need to know we could count on you, rain or shine." "I understand," Martha replied. "What I'm proposing is a regular schedule, perhaps once every 2 weeks, with emergency trips as needed. I would charge a modest fee for the service, but I think you'd find it fair considering the time and effort involved." Mr. Miller nodded slowly. "What kind of goods would you be able to carry?" "Anything within reason," Martha said. "Letters, small packages, orders for supplies that I could pick up in town and deliver on my next trip. I wouldn't be able to handle large or heavy items, but for most everyday needs, I think the system would work well." The Millers exchanged glances, and Martha could see them weighing the advantages against the cost. Finally, Mrs. Miller smiled. "I think it sounds like a wonderful idea," she said. "When would you want to start?" The second cabin belonged to the Johnsons, an elderly couple who lived with their adult son and his wife. They were even more enthusiastic about Martha's proposal, particularly when she mentioned that she could help coordinate medical supplies if needed. "Dr. Harrison in town doesn't like to make house calls this far out," the younger Mrs. Johnson explained. "If someone could bring medicines up regularly, it would be a real blessing." By the time they reached the third cabin, Martha was feeling confident about her prospects. The Kelly family consisted of a single father with 2 young daughters, and Martha could see immediately that they would benefit greatly from regular contact with town. "The girls need school supplies," Mr. Kelly explained, "and I'm not much good at picking out things like fabric and thread. Having someone who could handle those kinds of errands would be invaluable. As they rode back toward Henry's cabin that evening, Martha felt a satisfaction she hadn't experienced in months. All three families had agreed to try her services, and they had worked out a reasonable fee structure that would allow her to earn a modest but adequate living. "You did well today," Henry said as they navigated a particularly tricky section of trail. "The families liked you, and more importantly, they trusted you. That's not something that comes easily to people living this far from civilization." "I like them too," Martha replied honestly. "They seem like good people, the kind who would appreciate reliable service and treat me fairly in return." As they crested a ridge that offered a spectacular view of the valley below, Henry pulled his horse to a stop. "There's something I should probably mention," he said, his tone suddenly serious. "Not everyone in town is going to approve of what you're doing. Some people might try to make trouble for you." Martha had been expecting this conversation, but it still made her stomach tighten with anxiety. "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that comes from people who think women should know their place," Henry said bluntly, "and from people who don't like the idea of anyone doing business with the Mountain families without going through the established channels." Martha frowned. "What established channels?" Henry's expression darkened slightly. "There are a few men in town who consider themselves the unofficial brokers for trade with the mountain communities. They don't like competition, especially from someone they can't control." "Are you talking about anyone in particular?" Martha asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Jason Garcia and his associates," Henry confirmed. "They've been trying to monopolize trade in this area for the past couple of years. They charge high fees and don't always deliver what they promise, but they have enough influence in town to make life difficult for anyone who challenges them." Martha had heard of Jason Garcia, though she had never had any direct dealings with him. He was known as a successful businessman who had interests in several local enterprises, but there had always been whispers about his methods. "What exactly could they do to stop me?" she asked. Henry was quiet for a moment, as if weighing how much to tell her. "They could spread rumors about your character," he said finally. "They could pressure the families you're working with to stop using your services. They could even try to have you arrested on some trumped-up charge." The possibilities he outlined were frightening, but Martha found that her fear was mixed with anger. She had done nothing wrong, was proposing nothing illegal or immoral. The idea that someone might try to prevent her from earning an honest living simply because it interfered with their profits was infuriating. "Then I'll have to be very careful," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her. "And I'll have to make sure my services are so reliable and fairly priced that the families won't want to give them up." Henry smiled at her determination. "That's exactly the right attitude," he said. "But Martha, if Garcia or his men ever approach you directly, you need to be very careful. They're not above using intimidation or even violence to get what they want." "Have they ever threatened you?" Martha asked, suddenly concerned for his safety as well as her own. Henry's smile faded. "Let's just say we've had our differences," he said. "They don't like the fact that I sometimes help the mountain families without charging them, and they especially don't like that I refuse to work with them." Martha absorbed this information silently as they continued down the trail. She was beginning to understand that Henry's reputation as a dangerous man might have less to do with his character and more to do with the fact that he represented a threat to certain people's business interests. "Henry," she said as his cabin came into view, "why are you really helping me? And please don't say it's just because you admire my determination." Henry reined in his horse and turned to look at her directly. "Because I think what you're doing is right," he said simply. "Because the mountain families deserve better than what Garcia and his friends offer them. And because I believe you're strong enough to succeed, even when things get difficult." The sincerity in his voice made Martha's chest tighten with emotion. It had been a long time since anyone had expressed that kind of faith in her abilities. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything. I know I couldn't have done this without your help." "You would have found a way," Henry replied. "Maybe not this exact way, but you would have found something. People with your kind of determination usually do." As they unsaddled the horses and settled them for the night, Martha found herself thinking about the day's events and what lay ahead. She had taken the first concrete steps toward building a new life for herself, But she was also aware that the real challenges were just beginning. "I should head back to town," she said as Henry finished caring for the horses. "I want to start making arrangements for my first official runs." "It's getting dark," Henry observed. "The trail can be treacherous at night, especially for someone who doesn't know it well." Martha hesitated. She knew he was right about the dangers, but she was also acutely aware of how her absence from town might be interpreted, especially if anyone discovered where she had spent the day. Henry seemed to understand her dilemma. "There's a spare room," he said matter-of-factly. "You're welcome to use it, and I'll ride part-way back with you in the morning to make sure you reach the main road safely." The offer was practical and generous, but Martha knew it was also potentially scandalous. A unmarried woman spending the night in a bachelor's cabin, even with the most innocent of intentions, would provide enough gossip to fuel the town's rumor mill for months. But as she looked at Henry's honest face and thought about the long, dangerous ride ahead of her, Martha realized that she cared less about potential gossip than she did about making sensible decisions. "Thank you," she said. "I'd appreciate that." The spare room was small but comfortable, with a narrow bed and a washstand that showed Henry's thoughtful attention to his guest needs. As Martha settled in for the night, she reflected on how much her life had changed in just 2 days. She had gone from desperate and nearly hopeless to having a clear plan for the future, and perhaps more importantly, an ally who believed in her ability to succeed. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with a crispness in the air that promised winter's approach. Martha woke early and found Henry already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with the same efficient movements she had observed the day before. "Sleep well?" he asked, handing her a cup of coffee that was perfectly brewed. "Better than I have in weeks," Martha admitted. "I think it's the first time in months that I've gone to sleep feeling hopeful about the future." They ate breakfast in comfortable silence, both lost in their own thoughts about the day ahead. Martha was mentally organizing her plans for establishing her new business, while Henry seemed to be considering something more serious. "Martha," he said finally, setting down his coffee cup, "I want you to promise me something." "What's that?" "If Garcia or any of his men ever approach you directly, don't try to handle it alone. Come to me, or at least tell someone in town you trust. These aren't people you want to face by yourself." The concern in his voice was unmistakable, and Martha found herself wondering exactly what kind of history existed between Henry and Jason Garcia. But she could see that this wasn't the time for detailed questions. "I promise," she said. "But Henry, what about you? If helping me puts you in danger—" "I can take care of myself," Henry replied, his tone gentle but firm. "It's you I'm worried about. You're new to this kind of situation, and you might not recognize the warning signs until it's too late." Martha nodded, accepting both his concern and his confidence in his own ability to handle trouble. As they prepared to leave for town, she found herself studying Henry's face, trying to understand the man who had shown her such unexpected kindness. There was something about him that suggested depths she hadn't yet begun to explore, a sense that his quiet strength came from experiences he rarely shared with others. But there was also a gentleness in the way he treated her, a careful respect that made her feel valued rather than pitied. The ride partway back to town gave Martha an opportunity to ask some of the questions that had been building in her mind. "Have you always lived alone up here?" she asked as they navigated a section of trail that wound through a grove of aspen trees, their leaves golden in the morning light. "Not always," Henry replied. "I came here about 8 years ago, after some things happened that made me want a different kind of life." The hesitation in his voice suggested that those things had been significant, but Martha sensed that pushing for details would be inappropriate. Instead, she asked a different question. "Do you ever regret it? Choosing isolation over community?" Henry considered this for several minutes before answering. "Sometimes," he said honestly, "there are things about living among people that I miss, but there are also things about solitude that I value more than I expected to. The freedom to make decisions based on what I think is right, rather than what others expect. The ability to help people without having to justify my choices to a community that might not understand." Martha understood exactly what he meant. "That's what I'm hoping to find," she said. "A way to live that feels authentic to who I am, rather than who other people think I should be." You'll find it, Henry said with quiet conviction. It might not be easy, and you might have to make some difficult choices along the way, but you'll find it. They reached the point where the mountain trail met the main road to town, and Henry pulled his horse to a stop. This is where I leave you, he said. The rest of the way is safe enough, and it's better if people don't see us riding into town together. Martha understood the wisdom of this decision, even as she found herself reluctant to part company. Henry's presence had become reassuring, a steady source of support in what felt like an uncertain world. "When will I see you again?" she asked, then immediately felt embarrassed by the eagerness in her voice. If Henry noticed her embarrassment, he was kind enough not to comment on it. "I usually come to town for supplies once a week," he said, "and you'll probably see me when you're making your runs to the mountain families. We'll cross paths regularly." Martha nodded, trying to look more businesslike than she felt. "Thank you again for everything," she said. "I couldn't have gotten started without your help." "You would have found a way," Henry repeated, echoing his words from the night before. "But I'm glad I could make it easier." As Martha rode the final stretch into town, she found herself thinking about Henry's confidence in her abilities. It had been so long since anyone had expressed that kind of faith in her that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen as capable and strong. Thomas had loved her, she knew that, but his love had been protective rather than empowering. He had wanted to shield her from the world's difficulties, not encourage her to face them head on. The difference was subtle but significant, and Martha was only beginning to understand how much she had missed having someone believe in her potential for independence. The town was just beginning to stir as she made her way through the main street toward her small rented room. A few early risers were already about their business, and Martha was relieved to see that her return didn't seem to attract any particular attention. But as she was stabling her horse, she became aware of someone watching her from across the street. A man she didn't recognize stood in the shadow of the general store, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. When she looked directly at him, he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that might have been polite if it hadn't felt somehow mocking, then disappeared around the corner of the building. Martha tried to shake off the uneasy feeling the encounter had given her, but Henry's warnings about Jason Garcia and his associates echoed in her mind. She made a mental note to be more careful about her movements around town and to pay attention to anyone who seemed to be taking an unusual interest in her activities. Over the next 2 weeks, Martha threw herself into establishing her new business with an energy and focus that surprised even her. She created a simple system for tracking orders and deliveries, established relationships with the merchants in town who would be supplying goods for the mountain families, and worked out the logistics of her routes to minimize travel time while maximizing efficiency. Her first official run to the North Ridge families went smoothly, with each family providing her with lists of needed supplies and payment for her services. The work was physically demanding, requiring long hours in the saddle and careful attention to weather conditions. But Martha found it deeply satisfying in a way that her previous domestic routine had never been. More importantly, she was earning enough to cover her basic expenses with a small amount left over for savings. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt financially secure, and the independence that came with earning her own living was intoxicating. But she was also beginning to understand that Henry's warnings about potential opposition had been well-founded. Several times during her trips around town, she had noticed men watching her with what seemed like more than casual interest. And on 2 occasions, merchants who had initially been willing to work with her had suddenly become reluctant to fill her orders, offering vague excuses that didn't quite ring true. The situation came to a head on a Thursday morning in late November as Martha was loading supplies for her weekly run to the mountain families. She had just finished securing a package of medicines Dr. Harrison had prepared for the elderly Mrs. Johnson when a man approached her outside the general store. "Mrs. Johnson, isn't it?" he said, his tone friendly but somehow predatory. "I'm Jason Garcia. I believe we have some mutual interest to discuss." Martha had been expecting this encounter, but it still made her pulse quicken with anxiety. Jason Garcia was a well-dressed man in his 40s, with the kind of smooth confidence that came from wielding power in a small community. But there was something in his eyes that made Martha instinctively wary. I'm not sure what interests we might have in common, Mr. Garcia, she replied, keeping her voice level and professional. Garcia smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. Oh, I think you do. You've been making quite a name for yourself, running supplies up to the mountain families. Admirable work, really, but perhaps not the safest occupation for a lady on her own. I appreciate your concern, Martha said carefully, but I'm quite capable of taking care of myself. I'm sure you are, Garcia replied, his tone becoming slightly less friendly. But the mountain country can be dangerous, especially for someone who doesn't understand all the complexities involved in trading with those communities. Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. What complexities would those be? Garcia's smile widened, but it was not a pleasant expression. Well, for instance, some of those families have outstanding debts to certain businessmen in town. It would be unfortunate if someone inadvertently interfered with the collection of those debts by providing services that made it easier for people to avoid their obligations. The implication was clear, and Martha felt a surge of anger that momentarily overcame her caution. Are you suggesting that helping people obtain necessary supplies is somehow interfering with legitimate business? I'm suggesting, Garcia said, his voice dropping to a more menacing tone, that you might want to consider the wisdom of continuing this particular venture. There are other ways for a widow to earn a living. Ways that don't involve traveling alone through dangerous territory or dealing with people who might not always have your best interests at heart. Martha straightened her shoulders and looked Garcia directly in the eye. Mr. Garcia, I appreciate your advice, but I'm quite satisfied with my current arrangements. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have deliveries to make. She turned to mount her horse, but Garcia's hand shot out to grasp her arm. His grip was firm enough to be threatening without being obviously violent. And Martha realized with a jolt of fear that they were standing in a location where no one else could clearly see what was happening. Mrs. Johnson, Garcia said quietly, his voice now openly threatening, I hope you'll reconsider. It would be a shame if something unfortunate were to happen to such a determined young woman. Martha pulled her arm free with more force than was strictly necessary. Are you threatening me, Mr. Garcia? Of course not, Garcia replied, his friendly smile returning. I'm simply expressing concern for your welfare. The mountains can be very dangerous, especially in winter. Accidents happen all the time. With that, he tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Martha standing beside her horse with her heart pounding and her hands shaking slightly. The encounter had been brief, but its message was unmistakable. Continue with her business and face the consequences. Martha forced herself to complete her preparations calmly, aware that several people on the street were watching her with curious eyes. She couldn't afford to let Garcia's intimidation tactics succeed, but she also couldn't ignore the very real danger his words had implied. As she rode out of town toward the mountain trails, Martha found herself thinking about Henry's offer of help. She had promised to tell him if Garcia approached her, but she was reluctant to involve him in what might become a dangerous situation. At the same time, she was beginning to realize that she might not be able to handle this challenge entirely on her own. The day's deliveries went smoothly, with each family expressing gratitude for her reliable service and several mentioning that they had heard rumors of other people trying to interfere with mountain trade. It was clear that Garcia's influence extended beyond the town itself, and that the mountain families were aware of the political undercurrents affecting their access to supplies. You be careful, dear, Mrs. Miller warned as Martha prepared to leave their cabin. There are people who don't like the idea of the mountain folk having too much independence. They'd rather keep us dependent on their services, even when those services aren't reliable or fairly priced. I'll be careful, Martha promised, though she was beginning to wonder if being careful would be enough. The ride back toward town took Martha past Henry's cabin, and she found herself slowing as she approached the familiar trail that led to his door. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, and she could see smoke rising from his chimney in the still air. Before she could talk herself out of it, Martha turned onto the side trail. She had promised to tell Henry if Garcia approached her, and despite her reluctance to involve him in her troubles, she knew that keeping her word was important. Henry emerged from his cabin before she had even dismounted, his expression immediately concerned when he saw her face. What happened? He asked without preamble. Martha told him about her encounter with Garcia, trying to keep her account factual and unemotional, despite the fear that still lingered from the morning's confrontation. Henry listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grim as she described Garcia's threats. "I should have expected this," he said when she finished. "Garcia doesn't like to be challenged, and he especially doesn't like to lose income to someone he can't control." "What do you think he'll do next?" Martha asked, dreading the answer. Henry was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "He'll probably try to pressure the families to stop using your services," he said finally. "He might also try to turn the town against you by spreading rumors about your character or your activities. And if those tactics don't work," Henry's expression darkened, "then he might try something more direct. Martha, I think you should consider suspending your business for a while, at least until we can figure out how to deal with Garcia's interference." The suggestion made Martha's stomach clench with disappointment and anger. She had worked so hard to establish her independence, had finally found something that gave her both financial security and personal satisfaction. The idea of giving it up because of one man's greed was infuriating. "I can't do that," she said firmly. "The families are depending on me, and I'm not going to let Garcia's bullying tactics succeed." Henry studied her face, and Martha could see him weighing her determination against the very real danger she faced. "Then we need to find a way to protect you," he said finally. "And we need to make sure Garcia understands that you're not as vulnerable as he thinks you are." "What do you mean?" Henry was quiet for so long that Martha began to wonder if he was reconsidering his offer of help. When he finally spoke, his words surprised her. "I mean that maybe it's time people in town understood that you have friends who are willing to stand with you," he said. "Garcia's power comes from the fact that he can intimidate people who are isolated and vulnerable. But you're not isolated, and you're stronger than he realizes." Martha felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. "Are you saying you'll help me stand up to him?" "I'm saying I'll help you in whatever way I can," Henry replied. "But Martha, you need to understand what that might mean. Garcia and I have a history, and if I get involved in this situation, it could escalate quickly." "What kind of history?" Henry hesitated, and Martha could see him struggling with how much to reveal. "Garcia has been trying to force me off my land for the past 2 years," he said finally. "He wants to expand his business operations into the higher elevations, and my presence here interferes with his plans. We've had several confrontations over the issue." Martha absorbed this information, beginning to understand why Henry had been so concerned about Garcia's potential retaliation. "Is that why people in town think you're dangerous? Because of your conflicts with Garcia?" Henry nodded grimly. "Garcia has been very effective at spreading stories about me, painting me as a violent man who can't be trusted around decent people. It's easier for him to operate if the community sees me as a threat rather than someone who might expose his methods." The pieces were beginning to fall into place for Martha. Henry's reputation, his isolation, even the way some people in town reacted when his name was mentioned, all made more sense when viewed through the lens of Garcia's influence. "So helping me would give him another reason to come after you," she said. "He's already coming after me," Henry replied matter-of-factly. "The question is whether we let him pick us off one at a time, or whether we stand together and show him that his intimidation tactics won't work." Martha looked at Henry's honest face, at the quiet strength in his eyes, and felt something shift inside her chest. This man who owed her nothing was willing to risk his own safety to help her maintain her independence. The gesture meant more to her than she could easily express. "What do you suggest we do?" she asked. Henry smiled, and for the first time since their conversation began, the expression reached his eyes. "I suggest we make it very clear to Garcia and anyone else who might be interested that you're not facing this situation alone. And I suggest we do it in a way that makes it difficult for him to retaliate without exposing his own methods." "How?" "By making your next supply run together," Henry said. "Publicly. Let the whole town see that you have support, and let Garcia know that any threats against you will have to go through me first." The plan was bold, but Martha could see the wisdom in it. Garcia's power came partly from his ability to isolate his targets, to make them feel like they had no choice but to submit to his demands. By demonstrating that she had a strong ally, she would be undermining one of his primary advantages. But she was also acutely aware of what Henry would be risking by taking such a public stand. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "Once we do this, there won't be any going back. Garcia will see you as a direct threat to his operations." Henry's smile widened. "Martha, he already sees me as a direct threat. The only difference is that now I'll have something worth fighting for beyond just my own independence." The warmth in his voice when he said those words made Martha's heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with fear or anxiety. She looked at Henry's face, at the genuine care and respect she saw there, and realized that something fundamental had shifted between them over the past few weeks. What had begun as a simple business arrangement had evolved into something deeper, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared values. Henry wasn't just helping her because he opposed Garcia's tactics. He was helping her because he believed in what she was doing, because he saw her as someone worth protecting and supporting. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words carrying more weight than a simple expression of gratitude. "I can't tell you how much this means to me." "You don't have to," Henry replied, his voice equally soft. "I understand what it's like to want to live on your own terms, and I understand what it costs to stand up to people who want to control you. We're stronger together than we are apart." They spent the next hour planning their strategy, working out the details of how to make their partnership visible without appearing to be deliberately provocative. Henry suggested that they time their next joint supply run to coincide with market day in town, when the streets would be busy and their departure would be witnessed by as many people as possible. "We'll make it look completely natural," he explained. "I'll come to town for my regular supplies, and we'll happen to leave for the mountains at the same time. Anyone watching will see that you're not traveling alone, but it won't look like we're making a deliberate statement." Martha agreed with the plan, though she was aware that their actions would inevitably be interpreted as exactly the kind of statement Henry claimed they were trying to avoid. In a small town, there was no such thing as a truly casual association between an unmarried woman and a bachelor, especially when that bachelor had Henry's reputation. But Martha found that she cared less about potential gossip than she had expected. Her priorities had shifted over the past few weeks, and maintaining her independence had become more important than maintaining her reputation for conventional behavior. As the evening grew darker and colder, Martha realized she should head back to town, but she was reluctant to leave the warmth and safety of Henry's cabin, reluctant to return to the uncertainty and potential danger that awaited her. "You're welcome to stay again tonight," Henry offered, as if reading her thoughts. "The trail can be treacherous in the dark, and there's no point in taking unnecessary risks." Martha accepted the offer gratefully, recognizing that Henry's concern for her safety was both practical and personal. As she settled into the familiar spare room, she found herself thinking about how much her life had changed since that first desperate morning when she had climbed the mountain trail to his door. She had come seeking a business opportunity, a way to earn a living that would allow her to maintain her independence. But she had found something much more valuable, a partnership with someone who understood her desires for autonomy and respected her strength, someone who was willing to stand with her against those who would try to control or diminish her. The next morning brought news that confirmed Henry's predictions about Garcia's next moves. When Martha arrived in town for their planned joint supply run, she found several of the merchants she usually dealt with suddenly reluctant to fill her orders. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Johnson," the proprietor of the general store said uncomfortably, "but I've been advised that it might not be wise to continue our business relationship. Nothing personal, you understand, but there are considerations that make it difficult for me to accommodate your requests." Martha felt a familiar surge of anger, but she managed to keep her voice level. "What considerations would those be, Mr. Peterson?" Peterson glanced around nervously, as if afraid someone might be listening. "Let's just say that certain people have expressed concerns about the wisdom of encouraging irregular trade arrangements. They feel it might be better for everyone if commerce with the mountain communities went through more established channels." The euphemisms were transparent, and Martha could see from Peterson's expression that he was uncomfortable with the position he had been forced to take. But it was also clear that Garcia's pressure tactics were working, at least with some of the local merchants. "I see," Martha said calmly. "Well, I appreciate your honesty, Mr. Peterson. I hope you won't regret this decision." As she left the general store, Martha saw Henry approaching from the direction of the livery stable. His presence was reassuring, but she was also aware of the curious glances their meeting was attracting from other people on the street. "Problems?" Henry asked quietly, reading her expression. "Some," Martha admitted. "It looks like Garcia has been busy since yesterday." Henry nodded grimly. "I expected as much. But don't worry, we have alternatives. There are merchants in the next town and over who would be happy to have your business. And the extra travel time won't add significantly to your costs." The solution was practical, but Martha knew it was also temporary. Garcia's influence might extend beyond the immediate area, and even if it didn't, the additional complications would make her business more difficult to maintain. But as they loaded their supplies and prepared to leave town together, Martha felt a sense of determination that surprised her with its intensity. She had worked too hard to build this new life to let Jason Garcia's bullying tactics destroy it. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the same courage and persistence that had brought her this far. The ride to the Mountain families took on a different character with Henry beside her. His presence was both comforting and energizing, a reminder that she was no longer facing her challenges alone. But it was also a statement to anyone who might be watching that Martha Johnson was not the vulnerable, isolated widow Garcia had assumed her to be. The Mountain families welcomed Henry warmly and seemed pleased to see that Martha had such a capable traveling companion. But Martha also noticed that several of them mentioned having been approached by other people offering similar services, people who had made it clear that continued independence might come at a cost. "Someone came by last week," Mr. Kelly told them as they unloaded supplies at his cabin, "said he represented certain business interests in town and that it might be wise for us to consider using more established trade routes. When I told him we were satisfied with Mrs. Johnson's services, he got a bit unfriendly." Henry and Martha exchanged glances. "Unfriendly how?" Henry asked. "Let's just say he made it clear that accidents can happen to people who make poor business decisions," Kelly replied grimly. "I told him that threats don't sit well with mountain folk and that we take care of our own problems. But I wanted you both to know what you're dealing with." Similar stories emerged at each of the cabins they visited, painting a picture of Garcia's organization as more extensive and more ruthless than Martha had realized. It was becoming clear that this was not simply a matter of business competition, but a systematic effort to control trade in the entire region. But Martha also noticed something else: the Mountain family's fierce loyalty to their independence and their determination to resist any attempts at coercion. These were people who had chosen to live on the margins of civilization precisely because they valued their freedom and they were not easily intimidated. "We stand with you, Mrs. Johnson," Mrs. Miller said as they prepared to leave her cabin. "You've been fair and reliable, and we won't be bullied into giving up good service for the sake of someone else's profits." The support was gratifying, but Martha was also aware that it put the families at risk. Garcia had already demonstrated his willingness to use threats and intimidation, and there was no telling how far he might be willing to go to achieve his goals. As they rode back toward Henry's cabin that evening, Martha found herself thinking about the larger implications of their situation. What had started as a personal quest for independence had evolved into something much more significant, a test of whether ordinary people could maintain their autonomy in the face of organized pressure from those who sought to control them. "Henry," she said as they crested a ridge that offered a view of the valley below, "what do you think Garcia will do next?" Henry was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant lights of the town. "I think he'll try to force a confrontation," he said finally. "He's invested too much effort in this campaign to back down now, and he can't afford to let us succeed. It would set a precedent that might encourage other people to resist his methods." "What kind of confrontation?" "The kind that will give him an excuse to claim we're the aggressors," Henry replied grimly. "Garcia is smart enough to know that he needs to maintain his reputation as a legitimate businessman. He'll try to provoke us into doing something that he can use to justify more aggressive retaliation." Martha absorbed this analysis, recognizing its accuracy even as it filled her with apprehension. "So what do? We stay calm, we document everything, and we make sure we always have witnesses when we deal with him or his people," Henry said. "And we prepare for the possibility that things might escalate beyond words and economic pressure." The implications of his words were sobering, but Martha found that her fear was balanced by a growing sense of resolve. She had come too far and risked too much to back down now, regardless of what Garcia might threaten. As they approached Henry's cabin, Martha realized that she was facing another decision point. She could continue to maintain the pretense that their partnership was purely professional, or she could acknowledge that something deeper had developed between them. The realization that she was falling in love with Henry Adams should have been more surprising than it was. But as she watched him care for the horses with the same gentle competence he brought to everything else, Martha found that her feelings seemed like a natural outgrowth of everything she had learned about his character. Henry was everything Thomas had not been: strong without being controlling, protective without being possessive, supportive of her independence rather than threatened by it. More than that, he saw her as a complete person rather than someone who needed to be sheltered from the world's difficulties. But Martha was also aware that acting on these feelings would complicate an already complex situation. Garcia would undoubtedly use any personal relationship between them as ammunition in his campaign to discredit them both. "Martha," Henry said as they finished settling the horses, "there's something I need to tell you." The serious tone in his voice made her look at him sharply. "What is it?" Henry hesitated, as if struggling with how to phrase his words. "I want you to know that whatever happens with Garcia, whatever risks we're taking by standing up to him, I don't regret getting involved. This partnership, this friendship, it means more to me than I think you realize." The words were carefully chosen, but Martha could hear the deeper emotion beneath them. Henry was offering her an opening, a chance to acknowledge that their relationship had evolved beyond simple business cooperation. "It means more to me too," she replied softly, meeting his gaze directly. "Much more than I expected when I first came to your door." They stood in the gathering darkness, the air between them charged with unspoken possibilities. Martha could feel the pull of attraction, the desire to step closer, to let their partnership become something more intimate and complete, but she could also feel the weight of the challenges they were facing. The knowledge that Garcia's campaign against them was far from over. Whatever developed between her and Henry would have to survive not just the normal complications of a new relationship, but the external pressure of people who wanted to destroy them both. "Henry," she said finally, "I think we should focus on dealing with Garcia first. Whatever this is between us, it deserves better than to be overshadowed by threats and conflict." Henry nodded, though Martha could see disappointment flicker across his expression. "You're probably right," he said. "But Martha, I want you to know that when this is over, when we've dealt with Garcia and secured your business, I hope we can explore what's developing between us." "So do I," Martha replied, and meant it completely. The confrontation Martha and Henry had been anticipating came sooner than either of them expected. 3 days after their joint supply run, Martha was preparing for her regular trip to the North Ridge families when she discovered that someone had tampered with her equipment during the night. The saddle had been cut in several places, damage that would have caused it to fail during a difficult section of trail, potentially resulting in serious injury or death. Her supply packs had been slashed as well, and several items had been scattered around the stable as if someone had been searching for something specific. Martha stood among the wreckage of her carefully organized supplies, feeling a mixture of anger and fear that made her hands shake. The message was clear: continue with your business and face escalating consequences. But along with the fear and anger, Martha felt something else: a fierce determination not to be intimidated. She had worked too hard to build this new life, had found too much meaning and satisfaction in her independence, to let Garcia's bullying tactics succeed. She was still surveying the damage when Henry arrived, having ridden into town early for reasons he didn't immediately explain. His expression darkened as he took in the scene, and Martha could see him struggling to control his own anger. "This has Garcia's signature all over it," he said grimly, kneeling to examine the cut leather. "Professional work, designed to look like random vandalism, but calculated to cause maximum harm." "What do we do now?" Martha asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded, despite the turmoil she felt inside. Henry stood and looked at her directly. "We document everything, we report it to the sheriff, and we make sure Garcia knows that his intimidation tactics aren't working." "Will the sheriff actually do anything?" Henry's expression suggested he had serious doubts about that possibility. Sheriff Williams is a decent man, but he's also politically cautious. He won't move against Garcia without overwhelming evidence, and Garcia is too smart to leave that kind of evidence behind. Martha nodded, having expected as much. In a small town, men like Garcia often wielded influence that extended well beyond their official positions. "So we're on our own," she said. "Not entirely," Henry replied. "There are people in this community who are tired of Garcia's methods, people who would support us if they thought we had a real chance of success, but they need to see that we're not going to be easily defeated." Martha looked at the damaged equipment scattered around the stable, then back at Henry's determined face. "What do you suggest?" "I suggest we replace this equipment, continue with your supply runs as scheduled, and make it very clear that we're not backing down," Henry said. "And I suggest we do it in a way that demonstrates we're prepared for whatever Garcia might try next." The plan Henry outlined was bold and potentially dangerous, but Martha could see the logic in it. By refusing to be intimidated, by continuing their operations despite the escalating threats, they would be calling Garcia's bluff and forcing him to either back down or escalate to more serious measures. But escalation was exactly what Martha feared. Garcia had already demonstrated his willingness to use property damage and implied threats. What would he do if those tactics failed to achieve his goals? "Henry," she said as they worked together to clean up the scattered supplies, "are you sure we're doing the right thing? Maybe it would be better to suspend operations for a while. Let things cool down." Henry paused in his work and looked at her seriously. "Martha, if we back down now, Garcia wins. And more than that, we send a message to every other bully in the territory that threats and intimidation work. Is that really the precedent you want to set?" Martha considered his words, weighing her fear against her principles. Henry was right about the larger implications of their struggle. This wasn't just about her small business or even their personal safety. It was about whether ordinary people could maintain their independence in the face of organized pressure. "No," she said finally, "it's not. But Henry, I need to know that you understand what we're risking. This could get very dangerous, very quickly." "I understand," Henry replied quietly, "and I need you to know that I'm willing to face that danger, not just because I oppose what Garcia represents, but because I believe in what you're doing, and because I believe in you." The sincerity in his voice made Martha's chest tighten with emotion. She looked at this man who was willing to risk his safety for her dreams, and felt a surge of affection so strong it almost overwhelmed her. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything. I couldn't do this without you." "Yes, you could," Henry replied with a slight smile, "but I'm glad you don't have to." They spent the rest of the morning replacing Martha's damaged equipment and reorganizing her supplies. Henry insisted on paying for the new saddle and packs, despite Martha's protest that she could cover the costs herself. "Consider it an investment in our partnership," he said when she tried to argue. "Besides, Garcia's actions have made this personal for me too. I want to see him fail as much as you do." As they worked, Martha found herself thinking about the evolution of their relationship. What had begun as a simple business arrangement had become a true partnership, built on mutual respect, shared values, and growing affection. Despite the dangers they faced, or perhaps because of them, she felt closer to Henry than she had ever felt to anyone. But she was also aware that their relationship existed in a state of suspended possibility. Until they resolved the situation with Garcia, until they could be certain of their safety and security, they couldn't fully explore what was developing between them. By afternoon, Martha was ready to make her scheduled supply run into the mountain families. Henry insisted on accompanying her, despite her arguments that his presence might further provoke Garcia. "Let him be provoked," Henry said firmly. "It's time he understood that you're not facing this alone." The ride to the North Ridge passed without incident, but Martha was acutely aware of being watched. Several times she caught glimpses of riders in the distance, people who seemed to be paralleling their route without getting close enough to be clearly identified. "Garcia's men," Henry confirmed when she pointed them out. "He wants to know our movements, probably trying to find a pattern he can exploit." The mountain families were disturbed to hear about the vandalism in town, and several offered to provide additional security for Martha's operations. "We could have some of our boys ride with you," Mr. Kelly suggested. These mountain trails can be dangerous for people who don't know them well, and it would be a shame if Garcia's men got lost and had an accident. The offer was generous, but Martha could see that accepting it would escalate the situation significantly. Garcia could hardly ignore the presence of armed mountain men escorting his target. "I appreciate the offer," she said carefully, "but I think that might make things worse rather than better." "The offer stands," Kelly replied grimly. "If Garcia wants a fight, he'll get one. But it'll be on our terms, not his." Similar sentiments were expressed at each cabin they visited, and Martha realized that Garcia had seriously underestimated the mountain family's commitment to their independence. These were people who had chosen to live on the margins precisely because they refused to be controlled, and they were prepared to defend that choice. As they rode back toward town that evening, Martha found herself thinking about the larger forces at play in their situation. Garcia represented more than just personal greed. He embodied a system that sought to control and exploit people who couldn't defend themselves. By standing up to him, she and Henry were challenging that system, but they were also making themselves targets for anyone who benefited from it. "Henry," she said as they paused to rest the horses at a scenic overlook, "do you ever wonder if we're fighting a battle we can't win?" Henry was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the valley below, where the lights of town were beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. "I think about it," he admitted, "but then I remember what the alternative looks like. Garcia controlling trade, the mountain families forced to accept whatever terms he offers, decent people having to choose between their principles and their survival. That's not a world I want to live in." Martha nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "Sometimes I think about what my life would be like if I had just accepted one of those marriage proposals. If I had chosen security over independence. Do you regret not taking that path?" Martha considered the question seriously. "No," she said finally. "Even with all the danger and uncertainty, I don't regret it. This feels like the first time in my life that I'm truly choosing my own direction." "That's worth fighting for," Henry said quietly. They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the challenges ahead. But as they approached the outskirts of town, they became aware of unusual activity on the main street. Groups of men were gathered in front of several buildings, their voices carrying clearly in the still air. "Something's happening," Martha observed, feeling a familiar flutter of anxiety. Henry nodded grimly. "Let's find out what." They rode slowly down the main street, trying to appear casual while observing the clusters of people engaged in intense conversations. Martha recognized several of Garcia's known associates among the groups, but there were also men she didn't recognize, strangers who had the look of hired muscle. "Mrs. Johnson," a voice called from the boardwalk in front of the general store. "Mrs. Johnson, might I have a word?" Martha turned to see Sheriff Williams approaching, his expression serious but not unfriendly. She exchanged glances with Henry, then rode over to where the sheriff stood. "Sheriff Williams," she said politely, "what can I do for you?" "I understand you've been having some trouble with vandalism," Williams said, his tone carefully neutral. "I wanted to let you know that I take such matters seriously and that I'm investigating the incident." Martha was surprised by his directness, having expected him to be more circumspect given Garcia's influence in the community. "I appreciate that, Sheriff. Do you have any leads?" Williams glanced around at the groups of men still gathered on the street, then back at Martha. "Let's just say that certain patterns are becoming clear," he said quietly. "And Mrs. Johnson, I want you to know that you have the right to conduct your business without interference, as long as you're operating within the law." The statement was significant, and Martha could see from Henry's expression that he understood its implications as well as she did. Sheriff Williams was taking a public stand, making it clear that he would not tolerate vigilante justice or extra-legal intimidation tactics. "Thank you, Sheriff," Martha said. "That means a great deal to me." Williams nodded and started to turn away, then paused. "Mrs. Johnson, I'd also recommend that you be extra careful over the next few days. Sometimes when people can't achieve their goals through conventional means, they become more creative in their methods." The warning was clear, and Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "I understand, Sheriff. I'll be careful." As Williams walked away, Henry moved his horse closer to Martha's. That was unexpected, he said quietly. But encouraging, Martha replied. At least we know we're not completely without official support. They were preparing to continue toward the stable when another voice called Martha's name. This time it was Jason Garcia himself, approaching from the direction of the saloon with several men Martha didn't recognize. Mrs. Johnson, Garcia said, his tone superficially friendly, but with an underlying edge that made Martha's skin crawl. I heard about the unfortunate incident with your equipment. Terrible thing, vandalism. Makes a person wonder if they're really safe pursuing certain activities. Martha felt Henry tense beside her, but she forced herself to remain calm. It was unfortunate, she agreed, but Sheriff Williams assures me that he's investigating the matter thoroughly. Garcia's smile widened, but the expression was predatory rather than pleasant. Oh yes, Sheriff Williams is very thorough. Sometimes too thorough for his own good. But then, we all have to live with the consequences of our choices, don't we? The threat was barely veiled, and Martha realized that Garcia was no longer bothering to maintain even a pretense of civility. The situation had escalated beyond subtle intimidation to open confrontation. Indeed we do, Martha replied evenly. And I'm quite comfortable with the choices I've made. Are you? Garcia asked, his voice dropping to a more menacing tone. Even when those choices put other people at risk? The mountain families you're so fond of, for instance. It would be terrible if something happened to them because they made poor decisions about who to trust. Martha felt a surge of anger so intense it momentarily overwhelmed her caution. Garcia wasn't just threatening her anymore. He was threatening innocent families who had done nothing but accept her services. Mr. Garcia, she said, her voice steady, despite the emotions churning inside her. If you have something to say to me, say it directly. But leave the mountain families out of your business disputes. Garcia laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth or humor. Business disputes? Mrs. Johnson, I'm afraid you've misunderstood the situation entirely. This isn't about business anymore. This is about people learning to respect established authority and understanding the consequences of defying it. Henry had been silent throughout the exchange, but now he urged his horse forward slightly, positioning himself between Martha and Garcia's group. Garcia, he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of warning that made several of Garcia's men shift uncomfortably. I think you've said enough. Garcia's attention shifted to Henry, and Martha could see genuine hatred flicker across his expression. Ah, the mountain man speaks. Still playing hero, Adams? Still thinking you can protect people from the consequences of their own poor judgment? I'm thinking that threats against innocent people cross a line that decent folks won't tolerate, Henry replied, his tone remaining calm, but his posture suggesting readiness for action. Threats? Garcia asked with mock innocence. I don't recall making any threats. I was simply pointing out that the mountain country can be dangerous, especially for people who don't understand the complexities of local politics. The standoff stretched between them, tense with the possibility of violence. Martha could see curious onlookers gathering at the edges of the confrontation, and she realized that whatever happened next would be witnessed by half the town. Gentlemen, Sheriff Williams' voice cut through the tension as he approached the group, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. Is there a problem here? Garcia's demeanor shifted instantly, his threatening posture replaced by an expression of innocent concern. No problem at all, Sheriff. Just having a friendly conversation with Mrs. Johnson about the importance of safety in the mountain country. Williams looked from Garcia to Henry to Martha, clearly reading the tension in the situation despite Garcia's attempt to defuse it. Mrs. Johnson, do you feel threatened in any way? Martha met the sheriff's gaze directly. I feel that Mr. Garcia has been very clear about his concerns regarding my business activities, she said carefully, and I appreciate his advice about mountain safety. Williams nodded slowly, understanding the subtext of her response. Well then, I'm sure everyone has business to attend to. Mr. Garcia, perhaps you and your associates would like to continue your evening elsewhere? It wasn't quite an order, but the authority behind Williams' suggestion was unmistakable. Garcia's expression tightened with frustration, but he was smart enough not to challenge the sheriff directly. Of course, Sheriff, he said with false pleasantness. Come along, gentlemen. The evening is young, and there are other matters that require our attention. As Garcia and his men moved away, Martha felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. But she was also aware that the confrontation had resolved nothing. If anything, Garcia's willingness to make threats in public suggested that he was moving toward more direct action. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said as Williams prepared to leave. "Just doing my job, ma'am," Williams replied. "But Mrs. Johnson, I meant what I said earlier about being careful. Some folks don't respond well to public embarrassment, and they have long memories." After Williams walked away, Martha and Henry rode in silence toward the stable. The evening's events had clarified the stakes of their struggle, but they had also demonstrated that they weren't facing Garcia alone. The sheriff's intervention had been subtle but significant, and Martha felt a cautious optimism about their chances of weathering whatever Garcia might try next. But as they cared for their horses and prepared to part for the night, Henry's expression remained troubled. "What are you thinking?" Martha asked, recognizing the signs of his internal deliberation. "I'm thinking that Garcia is getting desperate," Henry replied, "and desperate men do unpredictable things. Tonight felt like a final warning, Martha. I don't think he's going to waste time on subtle intimidation anymore." Martha had reached the same conclusion, though she had been hoping Henry might see something she had missed. "So what do we do?" "We prepare for the worst while hoping for the best," Henry said grimly. "And we make sure we're never alone or vulnerable when Garcia decides to make his move." The implications of his words were sobering, but Martha found that her fear was balanced by determination. She had come too far to back down now, regardless of what Garcia might threaten. "Henry," she said as they prepared to part, "I want you to know that whatever happens, I don't regret any of this. Building this business, standing up to Garcia, developing our partnership, none of it. Even if things go badly, I'm grateful for the chance to choose my own path." Henry's expression softened. "Martha, things aren't going to go badly. We're going to get through this, and when we do, we're going to build something better than either of us could have managed alone." The confidence in his voice was reassuring, but Martha could also hear the deeper emotion beneath his words. Henry wasn't just talking about their business partnership. He was talking about the personal relationship that had been developing between them. "I hope you're right," she said softly. "I am right," Henry replied with quiet conviction. "We're stronger together than Garcia realizes, and we have more support than he understands. Tomorrow we'll continue with your regular supply run, and we'll show him that his intimidation tactics haven't worked." Martha nodded, drawing strength from Henry's confidence, even as she remained aware of the dangers they faced. Whatever Garcia might try next, she would meet it with the same courage and determination that had brought her this far. But as she made her way to her small rented room that night, Martha couldn't shake the feeling that events were building toward a confrontation that would test everything she had learned about herself over the past few months. The quiet life she had once imagined for herself was gone forever, replaced by something more challenging, but also more meaningful. She fell asleep thinking about Henry's words, about the partnership they had built, and the future they might create together if they could survive whatever Garcia had planned for them. The next morning brought news that confirmed Martha's worst fears about Garcia's intentions. She woke to find a message slipped under her door, written in an unfamiliar hand but carrying Garcia's unmistakable signature of veiled threats and false concern. "Mrs. Johnson," the note read, "I understand you plan to continue your mountain activities despite recent difficulties. I feel obligated to inform you that conditions in the high country have become particularly dangerous lately. Several travelers have reported encounters with hostile individuals, and there have been rumors of accidents befalling those who venture into remote areas without proper precautions. I would hate to see anything unfortunate happen to someone who has shown such determination in pursuing her chosen path. A concerned citizen." Martha read the message twice, her anger growing with each word. Garcia wasn't even bothering to disguise his threats anymore. He was making it clear that continuing her business would result in direct action against her. But along with the anger, Martha felt something else, a fierce resolve not to be intimidated. She had built something meaningful with her supply business, had found purpose and independence that she had never imagined possible. She would not let Garcia's bullying tactics destroy what she had worked so hard to create. When Henry arrived at the stable for their planned supply run, Martha showed him the message without comment. She watched his expression darken as he read, saw his jaw tighten with controlled anger. "He's not even pretending anymore," Henry said grimly. "This is a direct threat, Martha. He's telling you that if you continue with today's run, something will happen to you. Then we'd better make sure we're prepared for whatever he has planned," Martha replied, surprised by how calm she sounded despite the fear churning in her stomach. Henry looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Are you sure about this? We could postpone the run, give ourselves time to plan better defenses." Martha shook her head firmly. "If we postpone now, Garcia wins. He gets to dictate our schedule, control our movements. That's exactly what he wants." Henry nodded slowly, understanding her reasoning even as he clearly wished she would choose a safer course. "Then we go, but we go prepared. And Martha, if anything happens, anything at all, you follow my lead without question. Agreed?" "Agreed," Martha said, though she wondered what kind of preparation could adequately protect them against whatever Garcia might have arranged. As they loaded their supplies and prepared to leave town, Martha noticed several of Garcia's known associates positioned at strategic points along the main street. They weren't making any effort to conceal their presence. In fact, they seemed to want her to know she was being watched. But Martha also noticed something else. Sheriff Williams was visible near the edge of town, ostensibly checking on some routine matter, but positioned where he could observe their departure. And she caught glimpses of other townspeople who seemed to be paying unusual attention to their movements, people whose expressions suggested sympathy rather than hostility. "Word has gotten around," Henry observed as they rode past the last buildings of the town. "People are choosing sides whether they realize it or not." Martha hoped that was true, but she was also aware that public sympathy wouldn't protect them if Garcia had arranged an ambush in the remote mountain trails. Once they left the relative safety of civilization, they would be entirely dependent on their own resources and whatever preparations Henry had made. The first part of their journey passed normally, with no sign of the hostile encounters Garcia's message had promised. But as they climbed higher into the mountains, following trails that grew increasingly remote and difficult, Martha became aware of being followed. "How many?" she asked quietly, not turning to look behind them. "At least 3, Henry replied, his voice tense with concentration. "Maybe more. They're staying back, probably waiting for us to reach a spot where they have tactical advantage." Martha felt her heart rate increase, but she also felt a strange sense of calm settling over her. The uncertainty was over. Garcia had made his move, and now they would discover whether their preparations were adequate to meet his challenge. "What do we do?" "We continue to the first cabin as planned," Henry said, "but we take the long route, the one that passes through Devil's Canyon. It's more difficult terrain, but it also offers better defensive positions if we need them." Martha nodded, trusting Henry's knowledge of the mountain trails, even as she wondered what kind of defensive positions he was referring to. She had never thought of the supply runs in military terms, but Garcia's escalating tactics were forcing them to consider possibilities she had never imagined. The trail to Devil's Canyon was everything Henry had promised: steep, rocky, and treacherous enough to challenge even experienced riders. But it was also spectacularly beautiful, with towering rock formations and sweeping views that made Martha temporarily forget the danger they faced. "There," Henry said quietly, pointing to a narrow passage between 2 massive boulders. "That's where they'll try to stop us, if they're going to make a move. It's the perfect spot for an ambush." Martha studied the terrain ahead, seeing what Henry meant. The passage was barely wide enough for 2 horses abreast, with high rock walls on both sides that would make escape impossible. Anyone controlling the far end of the passage could trap travelers with minimal effort. "Can we go around?" Henry shook his head. "Not without adding hours to our journey, and they just follow us to the next choke point. Better to deal with this on our terms than let them choose the time and place." As they approached the narrow passage, Martha could see movement among the rocks above. Garcia's men were in position, just as Henry had predicted. But she could also see that Henry had been busy during the early morning hours, because there were other figures positioned on the high ground, people she didn't recognize but who seemed to be working in coordination with Henry's plans. "Friends of yours?" she asked quietly. "Some of the mountain men," Henry replied. They don't like Garcia's methods any more than we do, and they have their own reasons for wanting to see him fail. The revelation that Henry had arranged backup was both reassuring and concerning. Martha was grateful for the additional protection, but she was also aware that the situation had escalated well beyond what she had originally envisioned. As they entered the narrow passage, Martha could feel the weight of watching eyes from the rocks above. The tension was almost unbearable, every sound magnified in the confined space between the towering stone walls. "Mrs. Johnson," a voice called from ahead of them, echoing off the canyon walls. "I'm afraid this is as far as you go." Three men emerged from concealment at the far end of the passage, their rifles trained on Martha and Henry. Martha recognized one of them as a man she had seen with Garcia in town, but the other two were strangers with the hard look of professional gunmen. "Gentlemen," Henry called back, his voice steady despite the obvious danger, "you're blocking a public trail. I suggest you move aside." The leader of the three men laughed harshly. "This trail is closed for maintenance, mountain man. Mrs. Johnson and her supplies won't be needed where she's going." Martha felt a chill at the man's words, but she also felt Henry's calm confidence beside her. Whatever plan he had developed, this was the moment it would be tested. "That's unfortunate," Henry replied conversationally, "because Mrs. Johnson has important deliveries to make, and I'd hate to see anyone interfere with legitimate business." "Your business ends here," the gunman snarled, raising his rifle to a more threatening position. "Both of you, dismount slowly and keep your hands visible." Instead of complying, Henry gave a sharp whistle that echoed through the canyon. The sound was immediately answered by similar whistles from the rocks above, and Martha saw the three gunmen's eyes widen as they realized they were not in control of the situation. "I think you gentlemen are the ones who need to move aside," Henry said calmly. "This is mountain country, and mountain folk don't take kindly to people who threaten their neighbors." The standoff stretched for several tense seconds, with the three gunmen clearly trying to assess their changed circumstances. Martha could see figures moving among the rocks above, though she couldn't tell how many of Henry's allies were in position. Finally, the leader of Garcia's men made a decision that proved he was more experienced than Martha had given him credit for. "This isn't over," he called out, slowly lowering his rifle. "Garcia doesn't forget, and he doesn't forgive." "Neither do mountain folk," Henry replied evenly. "Tell Garcia that if he wants to control trade in this territory, he'll have to find a way to do it that doesn't involve threatening innocent people." The three men withdrew as carefully as they had appeared, disappearing into the maze of rocks and crevices that honeycombed the canyon walls. But Martha knew Henry was right. This confrontation had resolved nothing. If anything, it had escalated their conflict with Garcia to a new level of seriousness. As they continued through the canyon and out onto the more open mountain trails, Martha found herself thinking about what had just happened. Henry had not only anticipated Garcia's ambush, but had arranged countermeasures that had turned the tables completely. The level of planning and coordination involved suggested that their struggle with Garcia was part of a larger conflict she was only beginning to understand. "Henry," she said as they rode toward the first cabin on their route, "how long have you been planning for something like this?" Henry was quiet for a moment, his gaze scanning the trail ahead for signs of additional trouble. "Since the day Garcia first tried to force me off my land," he said finally, "I knew it would eventually come to a confrontation, and I wanted to be ready when it did." "And the mountain men who helped us back there?" "People who value their independence and don't like bullies," Henry replied. "Garcia has made enemies throughout this territory, Martha. More enemies than he realizes." Martha absorbed this information, beginning to understand that her personal struggle with Garcia was part of a much larger conflict over who would control commerce and settlement in the mountain territory. By standing up to Garcia, she had aligned herself with forces that had been building opposition to his methods for years. The realization was both empowering and frightening. She was no longer just a widow trying to earn an independent living. She had become a symbol in a larger struggle for freedom and self-determination. The rest of their supply run proceeded without incident, though Martha remained alert for signs of additional trouble. The mountain families were relieved to see them arrive safely, having heard rumors about Garcia's escalating campaign of intimidation. "We were worried," Mrs. Miller admitted as they unloaded supplies at her cabin. "Word travels fast in the mountains, and we heard there might be trouble on the trails today." "There was some trouble," Martha confirmed, "but we had help from friends." The Mountain family's gratitude for her continued service was deeply moving, but Martha was also aware of the risks they were taking by supporting her business. Garcia's threats had extended to them as well, and their loyalty came at a potential cost. "Mrs. Johnson," Mr. Kelly said as they prepared to leave his cabin, "I want you to know that we're prepared to do more than just accept your services. If Garcia wants a fight over who controls trade in these mountains, he'll get one." The offer was generous, but Martha could see that accepting it would transform their business dispute into something approaching a small war. She was beginning to understand the full implications of the path she had chosen. As they rode back toward town that evening, Martha found herself thinking about the future. The confrontation in Devil's Canyon had demonstrated that she and Henry could successfully resist Garcia's intimidation tactics. But it had also shown that Garcia was prepared to use increasingly serious measures to achieve his goals. "Where do we go from here?" she asked as they paused to rest the horses at a scenic overlook. Henry was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "I think we've reached the point where Garcia has to make a choice," he said finally. "He can either back down and accept that his intimidation tactics haven't worked, or he can escalate to measures that will expose him to serious legal consequences. Which do you think he'll choose?" "Based on what I know about Garcia, I think he'll escalate," Henry replied grimly. "He's invested too much in this campaign to back down now, and his reputation depends on people believing he can control opposition to his methods." Martha had reached the same conclusion, though she had been hoping Henry might see possibilities she had missed. "So what do we do to prepare?" "We continue with your business as planned. We document everything Garcia does, and we make sure Sheriff Williams understands exactly what kind of man he's dealing with," Henry said. "And Martha, we prepare for the possibility that things might get very dangerous very quickly." The warning was sobering, but Martha found that her determination remained unshaken. She had discovered something about herself over the past few months, something about her capacity for courage and her commitment to independence. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would meet them with the same resolve that had brought her this far. But as they rode toward town under a sky brilliant with stars, Martha was also aware of how much her relationship with Henry had deepened through their shared struggles. What had begun as a business partnership had evolved into something much more significant, a true alliance built on mutual respect, shared values, and growing love. "Henry," she said as the lights of town came into view, "I need you to know how grateful I am for everything you've done. Not just the practical help, but the way you've believed in me, supported my independence instead of trying to control it." Henry's expression softened in the starlight. "Martha, you've given me something I didn't know I was missing. A sense of purpose, a reason to fight for something beyond just my own survival. Whatever happens with Garcia, whatever challenges we face, I want to face them together." The declaration was as close to a declaration of love as the circumstances allowed, and Martha felt her heart swell with emotion. Despite all the danger and uncertainty, despite Garcia's threats and the escalating conflict, she had found something precious, a partnership with someone who saw her as an equal, who supported her dreams instead of trying to diminish them. "Together," she agreed softly, and meant it with every fiber of her being. As they entered the town, Martha noticed unusual activity on the main street. Groups of men were gathered in front of several buildings, their voices carrying clearly in the still night air. But unlike the previous evening, the conversations seemed more organized, more purposeful. "Town meeting," Henry observed, noting the direction of the crowds. "Looks like Garcia has called in reinforcements." Martha could see what he meant. Among the familiar faces of Garcia's local associates were strangers, men with the hard look of professional gunmen and the expensive clothes of out-of-town business interests. "He's escalating faster than I expected," Henry said grimly. "This isn't just about your supply business anymore, Martha. Garcia is making a play for control of the entire territory." The realization sent a chill through Martha, but it also clarified the stakes of their struggle. They weren't just fighting for her right to earn an independent living. They were fighting for the freedom of everyone in the mountain territory to make their own choices about trade and commerce. As they approached the stable, Sheriff Williams emerged from the shadows near the building. His expression was grim, and Martha could see the weight of serious concerns in his posture. "Mrs. Johnson, Mr. Adams," he said quietly, "I need to speak with both of you, privately." They followed Williams into the stable, where the sheriff checked carefully to ensure they weren't being overheard before speaking. "I'll be direct," Williams said without preamble. "Garcia has filed formal complaints against both of you, claiming that you're interfering with legitimate business operations and threatening public safety. He's also brought in outside support, men with connections to territorial authorities." Martha felt her stomach drop. "What kind of complaints?" "He's claiming that your supply business is operating without proper licenses, that you're transporting goods across territorial boundaries without authorization, and that you're conspiring with known criminals to intimidate legitimate businessmen," Williams replied. The charges were serious, and Martha could see how Garcia might make them stick, especially with the support of corrupt officials from outside the local area. "Sheriff," Henry said carefully, "you know those charges are false. You've seen Garcia's methods firsthand." Williams nodded grimly. "I know they're false, but that doesn't mean they won't be effective. Garcia has brought in a territorial marshal who's known for being flexible in his interpretation of the law. If they can make any of these charges stick, they can shut down Mrs. Johnson's business and possibly have both of you arrested." The implications were staggering. Martha had known that Garcia was ruthless, but she hadn't anticipated that he would have connections to corrupt territorial authorities. "What do you recommend?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear churning inside her. Williams was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing his words carefully. "Officially, I have to advise you to suspend your business activities until these charges can be resolved through proper legal channels," he said. "Unofficially, I think you should know that Garcia's marshal friend has a reputation for making problems disappear permanently for people who pay him enough." The warning was clear, and Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Garcia wasn't just trying to shut down her business. He was potentially planning to have them killed under the cover of legal authority. "How long do we have?" Henry asked. "The marshal is supposed to arrive tomorrow," Williams replied. "After that, your options become very limited very quickly." Martha looked at Henry, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his expression. They had reached the point where continuing to resist Garcia would require them to operate outside the law, to become fugitives in their own territory. But the alternative was to surrender everything they had worked for, to let Garcia's corruption triumph over their principles and independence. "Sheriff," Martha said finally, "if we were to disappear for a while, how hard would you look for us?" Williams smiled slightly, the first genuine expression of warmth she had seen from him all evening. "Mrs. Johnson, I'm a busy man with many responsibilities. If certain people happened to be unavailable when outside authorities came looking for them, it might take me quite a while to organize an effective search." The offer was generous and dangerous, putting Williams's own position at risk. But it also provided them with a potential path forward, a way to continue their resistance without being trapped by Garcia's legal machinations. "Thank you, Sheriff," Henry said quietly. "We appreciate everything you've done." Williams nodded and prepared to leave, then paused. "One more thing. There are people in this community who are tired of Garcia's methods, people who would support you if they thought you had a real chance of success. But they need to see that you're not giving up, that you're still fighting for what's right." After Williams left, Martha and Henry stood in the quiet stable, both absorbing the implications of what they had learned. The situation had escalated beyond anything either of them had anticipated, but it had also clarified their choices. "We could run," Martha said quietly. "Leave the territory entirely. Start over somewhere else." Henry shook his head. "Garcia would just expand his operations to fill the vacuum we left behind. And Martha, running away isn't really an option for either of us. This is our home, our community. We have a right to be here." Martha knew he was right, but she was also aware of the enormous risks involved in continuing their resistance. "So what do we do?" "We disappear for a while, like you suggested," Henry replied. "But we don't run away. We go to ground, continue operating from the shadows, and build support for a more permanent solution to the Garcia problem." The plan was audacious and dangerous, but Martha could see the logic in it. By removing themselves from Garcia's immediate reach, they would force him to reveal more of his methods while giving themselves time to organize more effective opposition. Where would we go? Henry smiled, and for the first time all evening, the expression seemed genuinely optimistic. I know places in the high country where Garcia's men would never find us, places where we could continue serving the mountain families while staying out of reach of corrupt marshals. Martha felt a flutter of excitement mixed with her apprehension. The idea of disappearing into the wilderness with Henry, of building a life together away from Garcia's influence, was both terrifying and appealing. It would mean giving up everything, she said. My room in town, any pretense of conventional respectability. It would mean choosing freedom over security, Henry corrected gently. And Martha, it would mean we could finally explore what's been developing between us without having to worry about external pressures and expectations. The personal dimension of his proposal made Martha's heart race. Despite all the danger and uncertainty, despite the enormous challenges they would face, the prospect of building a life with Henry was deeply appealing. How long would we have to stay hidden? Until we can expose Garcia's corruption and build enough support to challenge him openly, Henry replied. It might be weeks or it might be months. But Martha, I believe we can do this. I believe we can build something better than what Garcia represents. Martha looked at Henry's honest face, at the quiet strength and determination she saw there, and felt her last reservations dissolve. She had come too far to back down now, had discovered too much about herself and her capacity for independence to surrender to Garcia's threats. When do we leave? She asked. Henry's smile widened. Before dawn. We'll take only what we absolutely need, and we'll disappear before Garcia's marshal arrives to serve his warrants. The decision was made, and Martha felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the man she had come to love, fighting for principles that mattered more than safety or conventional success. The hours before dawn passed quickly as Martha and Henry prepared for their disappearance into the high country. Martha packed only essential supplies, leaving behind most of her possessions, along with any hope of returning to her previous life in town. But as she gathered her few treasured belongings, Martha realized that she felt no regret about abandoning the conventional respectability she had once valued. The past few months had shown her what real independence looked like, and she would not trade that knowledge for any amount of social approval. Henry had been busy making his own preparations, arranging for allies to monitor Garcia's activities and maintain communication with the mountain families. By the time Martha met him at the stable in the pre-dawn darkness, he had organized a network of support that would allow them to continue their resistance even while remaining hidden. "Ready?" he asked as they loaded their supplies onto pack horses. Martha looked back at the town where she had tried to build a conventional life after Thomas's death, then forward toward the mountains where she had discovered her true strength and purpose. "Ready," she said with quiet conviction. They rode out of town in the darkness, taking trails that Henry knew would be difficult for Garcia's men to follow. As the sun rose over the peaks ahead of them, Martha felt a sense of liberation that surprised her with its intensity. She was leaving behind everything that represented security and conventional success, but she was also leaving behind everything that had constrained and limited her. For the first time in her life, she was truly free to choose her own path, to build a life based on her own values rather than other people's expectations. The high country hideout Henry had chosen was everything he had promised: remote, defensible, and beautiful beyond description. The cabin was small but well-built, positioned in a valley that offered spectacular views while remaining hidden from casual observation. "It's perfect," Martha said as they unloaded their supplies. "It's home," Henry replied, and something in his tone made Martha look at him more closely. "For how long?" Henry set down the pack he was carrying and looked at her directly. "For as long as you want it to be," he said quietly. "Martha, I know we agreed to focus on dealing with Garcia first, but hiding out together like this, it changes things between us." Martha understood exactly what he meant. Living together in isolation, depending on each other for everything from safety to companionship, would inevitably deepen their relationship beyond anything they had experienced in town. "I know," she said softly, "and Henry, I'm ready for things to change between us." more than ready. The admission hung between them for a moment, charged with possibility and promise. Then Henry stepped closer, his hands coming up to frame her face with gentle reverence. "Martha," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I love you. I love your strength, your determination, your refusal to be diminished by other people's expectations. I want to build a life with you, here or anywhere else you choose." Martha felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness but from overwhelming joy. "I love you too," she whispered, "more than I thought possible, more than I ever imagined I could love anyone." Henry's kiss was gentle at first, then deeper as Martha responded with all the passion she had been holding back for weeks. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Martha could see her own wonder and desire reflected in Henry's eyes. "We should probably finish unloading," Henry said with a slight smile, though he made no move to step away from her. "Probably," Martha agreed, though she was equally reluctant to break the moment. They worked together to establish their temporary home, but the atmosphere between them had shifted fundamentally. The careful restraint they had maintained in town was no longer necessary, and Martha found herself reveling in the freedom to touch Henry casually, to express her affection without worrying about social conventions. That evening, as they sat by the fire in their hidden valley, Martha reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this point. 6 months ago, she had been a conventional widow, struggling to survive within the narrow confines of social expectations. Now she was a fugitive from corrupt authority, living in the wilderness with the man she loved, fighting for principles that mattered more than safety or respectability. "Do you ever regret it?" Henry asked, as if reading her thoughts. "Giving up the life you had planned for something this uncertain?" Martha considered the question seriously, looking around at their simple but comfortable shelter, at the magnificent wilderness that surrounded them, at Henry's face in the firelight. "Never," she said with complete honesty. "This feels more like the life I was meant to live than anything I ever imagined for myself." Henry smiled and reached for her hand. "Even though we're hiding from the law, living like outlaws?" "Especially because of that," Martha replied. "We're not hiding from justice, Henry. We're hiding from corruption. There's a difference." Over the following days, Martha and Henry settled into a routine that combined practical survival with continued resistance to Garcia's operations. They maintained contact with their allies in town and the mountain families, coordinating supply runs and gathering intelligence about Garcia's activities. But they also explored the deepening relationship between them, discovering a compatibility and mutual understanding that went far beyond their shared opposition to Garcia. Martha had never imagined that love could be both passionate and peaceful, both exciting and comfortable. "I keep thinking about what we'll do when this is over," she said one morning as they prepared for a carefully planned supply run to the Northridge families. "What do you want to do?" Henry asked. Martha thought about it as they loaded their pack horses. "I want to continue the supply business, but I also want to expand it. There are other communities in the territory that could benefit from reliable trade connections, and I want to do it openly without having to hide from corrupt officials." "That sounds like a worthy goal," Henry said. "What else?" Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she pressed on with her answer. "I want to marry you. I want to build a real life together, not just a temporary partnership." Henry's face lit up with joy. "Martha Johnson, are you proposing to me?" "I suppose I am," Martha replied, surprised by her own boldness. "Is that scandalous enough for a woman who's already living in sin with a dangerous mountain man?" Henry laughed and pulled her into his arms. "It's perfect," he said, spinning her around in the morning sunlight. "And yes, I accept your proposal." Their happiness was interrupted by the arrival of one of their allies from town, a young man named Matthew Wilson, who served as their primary source of intelligence about Garcia's activities. "You need to know what's happening," Matthew said without preamble as he dismounted from his exhausted horse. "Garcia's marshal friend arrived yesterday, and they've been conducting searches throughout the town. But that's not the worst of it." "What's the worst of it?" Henry asked grimly. "Garcia has been spreading word that you two are armed and dangerous fugitives who've been threatening innocent people," Matthew replied. "He's put a bounty on your heads, claiming it's for the protection of the community." Martha felt her stomach clench with anxiety. How much of a bounty? Enough to attract every bounty hunter and opportunist in the territory, Matthew said. And Garcia's been very clear that he doesn't care if you're brought back alive or dead. The news was sobering, but Martha found that her primary emotion was anger rather than fear. Garcia's willingness to put a price on their heads demonstrated the depth of his corruption and the extent of his desperation. "What about Sheriff Williams?" Henry asked. "He's trying to maintain some semblance of legal process, but the territorial marshal is pressuring him to cooperate with the manhunt," Matthew replied. "Williams is walking a fine line between doing his job and protecting you two." Martha looked at Henry, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his expression. Their situation had become untenable. They couldn't remain hidden indefinitely while Garcia consolidated his control over the territory. "It's time to go on the offensive," Henry said quietly. "We can't win this fight by hiding." "What do you have in mind?" Martha asked, though she suspected she already knew. "We expose Garcia's corruption publicly, in a way that even his bought marshal can't ignore," Henry replied. "And we do it in front of enough witnesses that he can't make the evidence disappear." The plan Henry outlined was audacious and extremely dangerous, but Martha could see the logic in it. By forcing a public confrontation, they would compel Garcia to reveal his methods while giving the community a chance to choose between his corruption and their principles. "When?" Martha asked. "Tomorrow is market day," Henry said. "The whole town will be gathered in the main square. If we're going to make a stand, that's the time and place to do it." Matthew looked alarmed. "You'll be walking into a trap. Garcia will have men positioned throughout the town, and the marshal will be there with legal authority to arrest you on sight. Then we'll have to make sure our case is compelling enough to override his legal authority," Martha replied. "And we'll have to trust that there are enough decent people in the community to support us when the truth comes out." The rest of the day was spent in careful preparation for what would essentially be a trial by public opinion. Martha and Henry gathered evidence of Garcia's corrupt practices, organized testimony from the mountain families he had threatened, and coordinated with their allies to ensure maximum impact for their revelations. But as evening approached, Martha found herself thinking less about strategy and more about the personal stakes involved. If their plan failed, she and Henry would likely be killed or imprisoned, their dreams of a life together destroyed by Garcia's corruption. "Are you scared?" Henry asked as they sat by their fire that night, knowing it might be their last peaceful evening together. "Terrified," Martha admitted honestly, "but also determined. We've come too far to back down now." Henry nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that these past few weeks with you have been the happiest of my life." Martha felt tears prick at her eyes. "Mine too. And Henry, whatever happens, I don't regret any of it. Not the business, not the conflict with Garcia, not falling in love with you. All of it has been worth it." They made love that night with a passion intensified by uncertainty, holding each other as if they could stop time and preserve the perfect intimacy they had found together. When morning came, they prepared for battle with the quiet determination of people who had found something worth fighting for. The ride into town felt like a journey toward destiny. Martha was acutely aware of every detail: the crisp morning air, the sound of their horses' hooves on the rocky trail, the way Henry sat straight in his saddle despite the dangers they were riding toward. As they approached the outskirts of town, they could see the crowds already gathering for market day. But there was an unusual tension in the air, a sense that the community was braced for something significant to happen. "Last chance to change your mind," Henry said quietly. Martha looked at the town where she had once tried to live a conventional life, then at the man who had helped her discover her true strength and purpose. "No," she said firmly, "this is what we came to do." They rode into town together, side by side, ready to face whatever Garcia had planned for them. The crowd parted as they approached the main square, and Martha could see recognition and surprise on many faces. Some people looked frightened, others curious, but she also saw expressions of support and encouragement from those who had grown tired of Garcia's methods. Garcia was waiting for them in the center of the square, flanked by his hired gunmen and the territorial marshal. His expression was triumphant, as if he believed their arrival meant his victory was assured. "Well, well," Garcia called out as they dismounted, his voice carrying clearly across the square. The famous fugitives have decided to surrender. How convenient. Martha stepped forward, her voice equally clear and strong. We're not here to surrender, Mr. Garcia. We're here to tell this community the truth about your methods and give them a chance to choose what kind of place they want to live in. The declaration sent a ripple of excitement through the crowd, and Martha could see that their dramatic arrival had achieved exactly the effect Henry had hoped for. The entire town was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Garcia's expression darkened. The only truth that matters is that you're both wanted fugitives, and Marshal Stevens here has warrants for your arrest. The territorial marshal stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun. Henry Adams and Martha Johnson, you're under arrest for conspiracy, intimidation, and interference with legitimate business operations. Surrender peacefully and you won't be harmed. Marshal Stevens, Martha replied calmly, before you execute those warrants, I think the community deserves to hear exactly what crimes we're supposed to have committed and what evidence Mr. Garcia has provided to support his charges. The request was reasonable and public enough that Stevens couldn't refuse without appearing arbitrary. Very well, he said reluctantly. Mr. Garcia, please state your charges for the record. Garcia stepped forward, clearly confident in his position. These two individuals have been operating an illegal transportation business, threatening legitimate merchants and conspiring with known criminals to intimidate honest businessmen. They've created a climate of fear and lawlessness that threatens the safety and prosperity of our entire community. Martha listened to the charges with growing anger, recognizing how Garcia had twisted every aspect of their legitimate business into something sinister. But she also recognized the opportunity he had just provided her. Those are serious accusations, she said when Garcia finished. I'm sure the community would like to hear some specific examples of these crimes, and perhaps some testimony from the people we're supposed to have threatened. Garcia's confidence faltered slightly. The evidence speaks for itself, he said. These people are dangerous criminals who... Actually, a voice called from the crowd, I'd like to hear some specifics too. Martha turned to see Sheriff Williams pushing through the crowd, his expression carefully neutral but his timing clearly deliberate. Sheriff Williams, Garcia said with obvious irritation, this is a territorial matter outside your jurisdiction. Maybe so, Williams replied, but it's happening in my town and I have a responsibility to ensure that justice is served fairly. Marshal Stevens, I'd like to hear the specific evidence supporting these charges. Stevens looked uncomfortable, clearly preferring to handle the arrest quickly and quietly rather than conducting a public examination of the evidence. The evidence is documented in my official reports, he said evasively. Then perhaps you could share some of that documentation with us, Martha suggested. After all, if we're such dangerous criminals, the community has a right to know exactly what we've done. The crowd murmured agreement, and Martha could see that public opinion was beginning to shift in their favor. Garcia's vague accusations were less compelling when subjected to demands for specific evidence. But Garcia was too experienced to be trapped so easily. Marshal Stevens has all the evidence he needs, he said firmly, and I have witnesses who can testify to these criminals' threatening behavior. Excellent, Henry said, speaking for the first time since their arrival. Let's hear from these witnesses. Garcia gestured to several of his associates, who stepped forward with obviously rehearsed testimony about threats and intimidation that Martha knew were complete fabrications. But as the false witnesses spoke, Martha noticed something else happening in the crowd. People were arriving from the mountain communities, families she recognized from her supply runs. They had come to town for market day, but their timing seemed more than coincidental. Those are interesting stories, Martha said when Garcia's witnesses finished, but I think the community should also hear from some of the people we're supposed to have been threatening. Before Garcia could object, Mrs. Miller stepped forward from the crowd. I'd like to say something, she announced in a clear, strong voice. Garcia tried to interrupt, but Sheriff Williams raised his hand. Let her speak, he said firmly. Everyone deserves to be heard. Mrs. Miller looked directly at Martha and Henry, then turned to address the crowd. These two people have been nothing but helpful and honest in all their dealings with my family and our neighbors. Mrs. Johnson has provided reliable, fairly priced service that has made our lives significantly easier. And Mr. Adams has been helping mountain families for years, never asking for anything in return. That's right, called out Mr. Kelly, pushing forward to join Mrs. Miller. And I'd like to know why Mr. Garcia thinks he has the right to control who we do business with. More mountain families stepped forward, each adding their testimony to the growing chorus of support for Martha and Henry. Their words painted a picture completely at odds with Garcia's accusations, and Martha could see the crowd's sympathies shifting decisively. But she could also see Garcia's growing desperation, and she knew that desperate men were capable of dangerous actions. "Enough!" Garcia shouted, his composure finally cracking. "These people are criminals, and they'll be arrested regardless of what these mountain folk have to say about it." The dismissive way he referred to the mountain families was a mistake that revealed his true attitudes, and Martha saw several townspeople react with obvious displeasure. "Mr. Garcia," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent square, "I think it's time the community understood what this is really about. You're not concerned about law and order. You're concerned about losing control over trade in this territory." "That's absurd," Garcia snarled, but his denial lacked conviction. Martha reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a folder of documents she and Henry had carefully prepared. "These are records of your business practices, Mr. Garcia. Letters threatening mountain families who refuse to use your services. Contracts with terms that would have bankrupted the people who signed them. Evidence of bribes paid to territorial officials to ensure your monopoly." The crowd stirred with interest, and Martha could see genuine surprise on Marshal Stevens's face. Clearly, Garcia had not shared all the relevant information when requesting the arrest warrants. "Those documents are forgeries," Garcia said quickly, but his voice had taken on a note of panic. "Are they?" Henry asked, stepping forward to stand beside Martha. "Then you won't mind if Marshal Stevens examines them, along with the testimony of the people who received your threats." Stevens looked from Garcia to the documents Martha was offering, clearly recognizing that the situation had become more complex than he had been led to believe. "I'll examine any evidence that's relevant to these charges," he said carefully. Garcia's face had gone pale, and Martha could see him calculating his rapidly diminishing options. The public examination of evidence was exactly what he had hoped to avoid, and the presence of so many witnesses made it impossible for him to simply make the problem disappear. But Garcia had not built his power through legal means alone, and Martha knew he was capable of resorting to violence when other methods failed. "This is ridiculous," Garcia said, his voice rising with desperation. "These people are armed fugitives, and they should be arrested immediately before someone gets hurt." As if on cue, several of Garcia's hired gunmen began moving closer to Martha and Henry, their hands hovering near their weapons. The tension in the square ratcheted up immediately as the crowd recognized the threat of imminent violence. But Martha noticed that Garcia's gunmen weren't the only ones who had come prepared for trouble. Mountain men had been filtering into the crowd throughout the confrontation, positioning themselves strategically around the square. Sheriff Williams had also positioned his deputies at key points, and even some of the townspeople had armed themselves. "Gentlemen," Sheriff Williams said loudly, his voice carrying a clear warning, "I'll remind everyone that this is a peaceful community gathering. Anyone who draws a weapon without justification will answer to me personally." The warning was directed at Garcia's men, but it applied equally to everyone present. Martha realized that the situation was balanced on a knife's edge, with the potential for violence that could devastate the entire community. "Mr. Garcia," she said, her voice steady despite the danger, "you have a choice to make. You can continue down this path of corruption and intimidation, or you can accept that the people of this territory have the right to make their own decisions about trade and commerce." Garcia's eyes darted around the square, taking in the faces of the crowd, the positioning of the various armed groups, the evidence Martha was still holding. Martha could see him weighing his options, calculating the odds of success versus the potential consequences of failure. "Marshal Stevens," Garcia said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled fury, "I demand that you arrest these fugitives immediately. They're a threat to public safety." Stevens looked at the crowd, at the mountain families standing firmly behind Martha and Henry, at the documents Martha was offering as evidence. "I'll examine the evidence first," he said firmly, "and I'll hear testimony from all relevant witnesses before making any arrests." It was a victory for due process, But Martha could see that Garcia wasn't prepared to accept it. His hand moved toward the gun at his hip, and she realized that he was preparing to take matters into his own hands. "Garcia," Henry said quietly, his own hand moving to his weapon, "don't do something you can't take back." The confrontation that had been building for months was finally at its breaking point. Garcia faced a choice between accepting defeat through legal means or escalating to violence that would expose him as the criminal Martha had always claimed he was. For a moment, the square was completely silent, with dozens of people holding their breath as they waited to see what Garcia would choose. Then Garcia drew his gun. The movement triggered an immediate response from multiple directions. Henry's weapon cleared leather with practiced speed, while Sheriff Williams and his deputies moved to control the situation. But Garcia wasn't aiming at Henry or the lawmen. He was aiming at Martha. "If I can't control this territory," Garcia snarled, his mask of respectability finally completely dropped, "then I'll make sure no one else can either." Time seemed to slow as Martha saw the barrel of Garcia's gun swing toward her. She could see Henry moving to intercept the threat, could hear Sheriff Williams shouting orders, could feel the crowd's collective intake of breath. But she could also see something else: the faces of the mountain families who had supported her, the townspeople who had grown tired of Garcia's methods, the community that was finally ready to stand up for what was right. Martha didn't flinch or try to run. Instead, she stood straight and met Garcia's eyes directly, refusing to be intimidated even in the face of deadly threat. "This is who you really are," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the silent square. "This is what Jason Garcia does when people refuse to submit to his control." The words seemed to break Garcia's concentration for just a moment, and that moment was enough. Henry's shot took Garcia in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his own shot wild. Sheriff Williams was on him immediately, disarming him while his deputies moved to control Garcia's associates. The confrontation was over in seconds, but its implications would resonate for years to come. Garcia's willingness to resort to attempted murder in front of dozens of witnesses had exposed his true nature more effectively than any amount of documentary evidence could have done. As the crowd began to process what had happened, Martha felt Henry's arms around her, holding her close as the adrenaline began to fade. "It's over," he whispered in her ear. "It's finally over." Martha looked around the square at the faces of her neighbors and allies, seeing shock, relief, and something else: a new determination to build a community based on fairness and mutual respect, rather than fear and intimidation. Marshal Stevens was examining Garcia's wound while Sheriff Williams secured the scene, but Martha could see from Stevens' expression that his attitude toward the situation had changed dramatically. Garcia's attempt to commit murder in front of witnesses had destroyed any credibility his accusations might have had. "Mrs. Johnson," Stevens said as he approached, "I believe there may have been some misunderstandings about the nature of the charges against you. I'll need to conduct a thorough investigation before proceeding with any arrests." It was as close to an admission of error as Martha was likely to get from a territorial marshal, but it was enough. The immediate threat of arrest had passed, and Garcia's power in the territory was broken. Over the following hours, as the crowd gradually dispersed and the immediate crisis passed, Martha found herself thinking about what came next. Garcia's defeat had opened up possibilities she had barely dared to imagine, but it had also created new responsibilities and challenges. "What are you thinking about?" Henry asked as they stood together in the square that had become the site of their victory. "The future," Martha replied honestly. "What we do now that we've won." Henry smiled and took her hand. "Now we build the life we talked about. We expand your business, we get married, and we help this community become the kind of place where people like Garcia can't take root." Martha squeezed his hand, feeling a deep sense of contentment despite the exhaustion of the day's events. "That sounds perfect," she said. "Absolutely perfect." As the sun set over the mountains that had become their home, Martha reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this point. She had started as a desperate widow, seeking only survival and basic independence. But she had discovered something far more valuable: the strength to fight for her principles, the love of a man who supported her dreams, and a community willing to stand with her against corruption and intimidation. The mountain man no one had wanted to marry had found his gentle heart, and the widow everyone had pitied had found her true strength. Together, They had built something neither could have achieved alone, a partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and unwavering love. 6 months later, Martha stood on the porch of the expanded cabin she and Henry had built together in the valley that had once been their hiding place. The morning sun painted the surrounding peaks in shades of gold and rose, and she could see riders approaching along the trail that had become a regular supply route serving communities throughout the territory. The business she had started with such uncertainty had grown beyond her wildest expectations. With Garcia's monopolistic practices ended, trade had flourished throughout the mountain territory. Martha now coordinated a network of suppliers and transporters that served dozens of communities, providing reliable, fairly priced services that had transformed the economic landscape of the region. But more than that, she had helped establish a model of commerce based on mutual respect and fair dealing, rather than intimidation and exploitation. The success of her approach had attracted attention from other territories, and she had begun receiving inquiries about expanding her methods to new regions. "Busy day ahead?" Henry asked as he joined her on the porch, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the contented expression that had become his default since their marriage 3 months earlier. "Always," Martha replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "But good busy, the kind that feels meaningful." Henry nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. He had found his own sense of purpose in their expanded operations, using his knowledge of the mountain country to help establish new routes and his reputation for fairness to build trust with communities that had been exploited by Garcia's methods. Together, they had created something that was both a successful business and a force for positive change in their territory. It was more than Martha had ever dared to dream when she first climbed the mountain trail to Henry's door. "Any word from Sheriff Williams about the territorial investigation?" Henry asked. Martha smiled. "Garcia and his associates are going to prison for a very long time. The territorial authorities were not pleased to discover how extensively their marshal had been corrupted, and they're taking steps to prevent similar problems in the future." The investigation that had followed Garcia's public breakdown had exposed a network of corruption that extended far beyond their local territory. Martha's documentation of Garcia's methods had provided crucial evidence, and her willingness to testify had helped ensure that justice was served. But perhaps more importantly, the community's response to the crisis had demonstrated that ordinary people could successfully resist organized corruption when they stood together. The example had inspired similar efforts in other territories, creating a movement toward more ethical and democratic governance throughout the region. "And the wedding?" Henry asked, referring to the ceremony they were planning for Lisa Martinez, one of the mountain women who had found love with a man from town during the aftermath of Garcia's defeat. "Everything's ready," Martha replied. "It's going to be beautiful." The wedding was one of several that had resulted from the increased contact between mountain and town communities that Martha's business had facilitated. The breakdown of Garcia's divisive influence had allowed relationships to develop that might never have been possible under his regime of fear and intimidation. Martha had found particular satisfaction in helping arrange these connections, seeing them as evidence that her work was contributing to more than just economic prosperity. She was helping build a more unified and harmonious community, one where people were judged by their character rather than their location or social status. As the morning progressed, Martha threw herself into the day's activities with the energy and enthusiasm that had become characteristic of her new life. She coordinated supply runs, reviewed proposals for new routes, and met with representatives from communities interested in joining their network. But she also made time for the personal relationships that had become so important to her. She visited with the mountain families who had supported her during the darkest days of her conflict with Garcia, sharing news and maintaining the friendships that had sustained her through difficult times. And throughout it all, she was acutely aware of Henry's presence beside her, his steady support and unwavering love providing the foundation that made everything else possible. "Do you ever miss it?" Henry asked that evening as they sat by their fire, watching the stars emerge over the mountain peaks. "The simple life you originally planned for yourself?" Martha considered the question seriously, thinking about the quiet, conventional existence she had once imagined. "No," she said finally, "that life would have been safe, but it wouldn't have been mine. This life, with all its challenges and uncertainties, feels like the life I was meant to live. Henry smiled and reached for her hand. Even though it's made you notorious throughout the territory, the widow who took on Jason Garcia and won? Martha laughed, remembering some of the more colorful stories that had grown up around their confrontation with Garcia. Especially because of that, I like being known as someone who stands up for what's right, even when it's difficult. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts about the journey that had brought them together and the future they were building. Martha reflected on how much she had changed since that desperate morning when she had first sought Henry's help, how much she had learned about her own strength and capacity for independence. But she also reflected on how much their love had grown and deepened through the challenges they had faced together. What had begun as mutual respect and shared values had evolved into something profound and unshakable, a partnership that enhanced both their individual strengths and their collective impact on their community. "Martha," Henry said softly, breaking the peaceful silence, "there's something I want to ask you." "What's that?" Henry turned to face her fully, his expression serious but warm. "I know we've talked about expanding the business, about serving new territories and building something even larger than what we have now. But I want to make sure that's really what you want, not just what seems like the logical next step." Martha appreciated the question, recognizing that Henry was giving her an opportunity to reconsider their direction without any pressure or expectations. It was typical of his respect for her independence and his commitment to ensuring that their partnership remained truly mutual. "It is what I want," she said after thinking about it carefully, "but not because I feel obligated to keep growing or proving myself. I want to expand because I've seen what we can accomplish when we work together, and I want to share that with other communities that are struggling with the same problems we faced." Henry nodded, clearly satisfied with her answer. "Then we'll do it together, whatever challenges it brings." The expansion of their business over the following year brought both tremendous success and new challenges. Martha found herself coordinating operations across multiple territories, dealing with complex logistical problems, and navigating political situations that made her original conflict with Garcia seem simple by comparison. But she also found that her reputation for fairness and integrity opened doors that might have remained closed to other entrepreneurs. Communities that had been exploited by corrupt businessmen were eager to work with someone who had proven her commitment to ethical practices, even when it meant personal risk. Henry proved to be an invaluable partner in these expanded operations, his calm wisdom and practical knowledge helping Martha navigate situations that might have overwhelmed her if she had been working alone. Together, they developed innovative solutions to transportation and communication challenges that became models for other businesses throughout the region. More than that, they continued to grow closer as both business partners and husband and wife. The challenges they faced only strengthened their bond, proving that their love could withstand not just external pressures, but the internal stresses that came with building something significant together. "I have news," Martha announced one evening as they reviewed the day's correspondence in their expanded office. "The territorial governor wants to meet with us." Henry looked up from the supply manifest he was studying. "Good news or bad news?" "Good, I think," Martha replied. "He's interested in our methods, wants to discuss the possibility of implementing similar approaches in territories where corruption has been a problem." The invitation was both flattering and potentially significant. If they could influence territorial policy, they might be able to create systemic changes that would prevent future Garcia-like situations from developing. But Martha was also aware that success on such a large scale would bring new responsibilities and new risks. The larger their influence became, the more enemies they were likely to make among those who benefited from corrupt practices. "What do you think?" she asked Henry, valuing his perspective on the political implications of the governor's invitation. "I think we have an opportunity to do something really important," Henry replied thoughtfully. "But I also think we need to be very careful about how we approach it. Political involvement can be dangerous, especially for people with our background." Martha nodded, understanding his concerns. Their success had been built on practical results and community support, not political connections or official authority. Moving into the political arena would require different skills and expose them to different kinds of risks, but it would also give them the potential to create lasting change on a scale they could never achieve through business operations alone. I want to do it, Martha said finally, but I want to do it our way, staying true to the principles that got us this far. Henry smiled. I wouldn't expect anything else from you. When do we meet with the governor? The meeting with the territorial governor proved to be even more significant than Martha had anticipated. Governor Williams, no relation to Sheriff Williams, was a reform-minded politician who had been elected on a platform of cleaning up corruption and promoting economic development through fair business practices. Mrs. Adams, he said as he welcomed Martha and Henry to his office in the territorial capital, your reputation precedes you. The story of how you stood up to Jason Garcia and built a successful business based on ethical principles has inspired reform efforts throughout the territory. Martha felt a flutter of pride at the recognition, but she was also aware that the governor's interest probably extended beyond simple admiration for their business success. Governor Williams, she replied, we appreciate your interest in our work. What can we do for you? The governor's proposal was ambitious and potentially transformative. He wanted Martha and Henry to help develop a new model for territorial commerce, one that would prevent the kind of monopolistic practices Garcia had employed while promoting fair competition and community development. We're talking about legislation that would protect small businesses and independent communities from exploitation, the governor explained. But legislation is only effective if it's based on practical experience and real-world solutions. That's where you come in. The opportunity to influence policy at the territorial level was exactly what Martha had hoped for when she first decided to expand their operations. But it also represented a significant commitment that would require them to spend considerable time away from their home territory and their established business operations. We're interested, Martha said carefully, but we need to understand exactly what kind of commitment you're looking for. The governor outlined a role that would combine policy development with practical implementation, working with communities throughout the territory to establish fair trade practices and resist corrupt influences. It was challenging work that would require all the skills Martha and Henry had developed, but it also offered the potential to create lasting positive change. We'll need time to consider your proposal, Henry said when the governor finished his presentation. Of course, the governor replied, but I hope you'll give it serious consideration. The territory needs people like you, people who have proven they're willing to fight for what's right, even when it's difficult. During the journey back to their mountain home, Martha and Henry discussed the governor's proposal extensively. Both could see the potential benefits of the position, but they were also aware of the sacrifices it would require. It would mean less time for our own business, Martha observed, and less time for the personal life we've built together. But it would also mean the chance to prevent other communities from going through what we experienced with Garcia, Henry replied. That seems worth some personal sacrifice. Martha agreed, but she was also conscious of how much she valued the life they had built in their mountain valley. The peace and contentment they had found together was precious, and she was reluctant to give it up for even the most worthy cause. What if we could find a way to do both, she suggested. Accept the governor's position, but structure it so that we can maintain our base here and continue our existing operations? Henry considered the idea. It would be challenging, but it might be possible. We'd need to delegate more of the day-to-day operations to trusted associates, but the core business could continue. The solution they eventually negotiated with the governor allowed them to maintain their mountain home while taking on territorial responsibilities. Martha would serve as a special advisor on commerce and community development, working with troubled territories while continuing to oversee their expanding business network. It was a compromise that satisfied everyone involved, but Martha was aware that it would test their ability to balance competing demands on their time and energy. The first year of Martha's work with the territorial government proved to be both rewarding and exhausting. She found herself traveling extensively, working with communities that were struggling with problems similar to those she and Henry had faced with Garcia. In some cases, the solutions were relatively straightforward, requiring nothing more than the establishment of fair trade practices and the enforcement of existing laws. But in other situations, Martha encountered corruption that was more deeply entrenched and more sophisticated than anything Garcia had attempted. It's like fighting a hydra, she told Henry during one of their brief reunions at their mountain home. Cut off one head of corruption and two more appear somewhere else. Henry could see the strain the work was taking on her, but he could also see the satisfaction she derived from helping communities that had been struggling without hope. Are you sorry you took the position? He asked. Martha considered the question carefully. No, she said finally. The work is harder than I expected, and I miss being home with you more than I thought I would, but I can see the difference we're making, and that makes it worthwhile. Henry's own work had evolved as well, taking on greater responsibility for their business operations while also serving as Martha's primary advisor on the communities they were trying to help. His deep knowledge of mountain territories and his reputation for fairness made him invaluable in situations where trust was difficult to establish. But the demands of their expanded responsibilities were also putting new stresses on their relationship. They were spending more time apart than they had since the early days of their partnership, and Martha sometimes wondered if they were losing something important in their pursuit of larger goals. I've been thinking, she said one evening, as they sat by their fire during a rare week when both were home, maybe we need to reconsider our priorities. Henry looked at her with concern. What do you mean? I mean that we've been so focused on expanding our impact and helping other communities that we might be neglecting what's most important to us personally, Martha replied. Our relationship, our home, our own happiness. Henry was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking about what she had said. Are you unhappy with the work we're doing? Not unhappy exactly, Martha said, but I'm starting to wonder if we can have everything we want or if we need to make some choices about what matters most to us. The conversation that followed was one of the most important they had ever had, touching on fundamental questions about their values, their goals, and their vision for their future together. Both realized that their success had created opportunities they had never imagined, but it had also created pressures and demands that were challenging their ability to maintain the personal relationship that was the foundation of everything else. I love the work we're doing, Martha said finally, but I love you more, and I love the life we've built together. If I have to choose between expanding our influence and preserving our relationship, I choose our relationship. Henry's relief was visible. I was hoping you'd say that, he admitted, because I've been feeling the same way. The work is important, but it's not more important than us. The decision to scale back their territorial responsibilities was not easy, but it proved to be the right choice for both of them. Martha negotiated a reduced role with the governor that allowed her to continue contributing to policy development while spending more time at home with Henry. Their business operations continued to expand, but at a more manageable pace that allowed them to maintain direct oversight and personal involvement. They found ways to help other communities without sacrificing their own well-being or their relationship. Most importantly, they rediscovered the joy and contentment that had drawn them together in the first place. The quiet evenings by their fire, the shared work of building something meaningful, the deep satisfaction of a partnership based on mutual respect and love. Do you ever regret not taking on more territorial responsibilities? Henry asked one evening as they watched the sunset paint the mountain peaks in brilliant colors. Martha considered the question, thinking about all the communities they might have helped, all the changes they might have influenced. Sometimes, she admitted, but then I think about what we have here, what we've built together, and I know we made the right choice. Henry nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. We're still making a difference, he said. Maybe not on the scale we might have, but in ways that matter to the people we're able to help. Martha agreed, recognizing that their influence extended far beyond their immediate business operations. The example they had set, the methods they had developed, and the principles they had demonstrated were being copied and adapted throughout the territory and beyond. They had proven that it was possible to build success without compromising integrity, to resist corruption without becoming cynical, and to maintain independence while building meaningful partnerships. Those lessons were spreading, creating changes that might ultimately be more significant than anything they could have achieved through official positions. As the years passed, Martha and Henry continued to evolve their business and their relationship, always seeking ways to grow and improve while staying true to the values that had brought them together. They faced new challenges and seized new opportunities, but they did so as partners in every sense of the word. Their love story became legendary throughout the territory, not just because of the dramatic confrontation with Garcia, but because of the way they had built a life together, based on mutual respect, shared goals, and unwavering commitment to each other's happiness and growth. The mountain man who had once been feared and avoided had found his gentle heart, and the widow who had once been pitied and dismissed had found her true strength. Together, they had created something beautiful and lasting, a partnership that enhanced both their individual capabilities and their collective impact on the world around them. 10 years after their first meeting, Martha stood once again on the porch of their mountain home, but now she was watching their children play in the meadow below, while Henry worked in the expanded garden that provided much of their food. The scene was peaceful and domestic, but it was also rich with the contentment that came from a life well lived. Their business had continued to grow and evolve, now encompassing a network of ethical traders and suppliers that served communities throughout the Western Territories. But more than that, it had become a model for how commerce could be conducted with integrity and fairness, inspiring similar operations in regions far from their mountain home. Martha had written a book about their experiences, sharing the lessons they had learned about building success while maintaining principles. The book had become popular among entrepreneurs and reformers, spreading their ideas even further than their direct business influence could reach. But perhaps their most important legacy was the family they had built together. Their 3 children were growing up with a deep understanding of the importance of fairness, integrity, and standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. "Mama," their eldest daughter called from the meadow, "tell us again about how you and Papa met." Martha smiled, remembering the desperate morning when she had first climbed the mountain trail to Henry's door. It seemed like a lifetime ago, but the lessons of that journey remained as relevant as ever. "Well," she began, settling into the rocking chair Henry had built for her, "it all started when I decided that I wanted to choose my own path in life, even if that path was difficult and uncertain." As she told the familiar story, Martha reflected on how much had changed since those early days of struggle and uncertainty. She had found not just independence in success, but love, partnership, and a sense of purpose that filled every day with meaning. Henry joined them on the porch as the story reached its climax, the dramatic confrontation in the town square that had changed everything. The children listened with rapt attention, even though they had heard the tale many times before. "And that's how your mother saved the territory from Jason Garcia," Henry concluded with a smile, "by being brave enough to stand up for what was right, even when everyone told her it was impossible." "Will we be that brave someday?" their youngest son asked. Martha and Henry exchanged glances, both thinking about the challenges their children would face as they grew up in a rapidly changing world. "You'll have your own chances to be brave," Martha said gently. "Different challenges than Papa and I faced, but just as important. The key is to always remember that doing what's right is more important than doing what's easy." As the evening wore on and the children were settled for the night, Martha and Henry sat together on their porch, watching the stars emerge over the mountain peaks that had become their permanent home. "Any regrets?" Henry asked, echoing a question they had asked each other many times over the years. Martha considered the question seriously, thinking about all the paths not taken, all the different choices they might have made. "None," she said finally. "This is exactly the life I would choose if I had to do it all over again." Henry reached for her hand, his touch as warm and reassuring as it had been on that first day when he had offered to help her build a new life. "Even the difficult parts?" he asked. "The conflict with Garcia, the years of struggle, the times when we weren't sure we'd succeed?" "Especially the difficult parts," Martha replied. "Those challenges taught us who we really were, what we were capable of. Without them, we never would have discovered the strength we had together." Henry nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Their love had been forged in the crucible of shared struggle, tested by adversity and strengthened by their commitment to supporting each other through whatever challenges they faced. "I love you, Martha Adams," Henry said softly, using the name she had taken when they married. The name that represented not just their legal union, but their complete partnership in all aspects of life. "I love you too, Henry Adams," Martha replied, squeezing his hand. "More than I ever thought possible. More than I ever imagined I could love anyone." They sat in comfortable silence, both lost in their own thoughts about the extraordinary journey that had brought them together and the life they had built in the years since. The mountain wind whispered through the pine trees, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers and the promise of tomorrow's adventures. Martha thought about the young widow who had once climbed this mountain trail in desperation, seeking nothing more than a way to survive with dignity. That woman could never have imagined the life that awaited her, the love she would find, the impact she would have on her community and beyond. But perhaps that was the most important lesson of all, that life's greatest rewards often came from the courage to step into uncertainty, to choose the difficult path when it led towards something meaningful and true. The mountain man no one had wanted to marry had indeed found his gentle heart, revealed through his patient kindness and unwavering support for the woman he loved. And the widow everyone had pitied had found her true strength, not in spite of her vulnerability, but because of her willingness to be brave when bravery was required. Together, they had built something that neither could have achieved alone. A love story that had become a legend, a business that had become a model, and a life that had become an inspiration to everyone who knew their story. As the night deepened around their mountain home, Martha and Henry continued to sit together, planning for tomorrow while cherishing the present, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as they always had, with courage, integrity, and an unshakable commitment to the love that had made everything else possible. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, witnesses to countless other love stories, other struggles, other triumphs. But for Martha and Henry Adams, this moment was perfect and complete, a culmination of all their dreams and the foundation for all their tomorrows. In the distance, a wolf howled its lonely song to the moon, but Martha felt no loneliness, no fear, no uncertainty about the future. She had found her place in the world, her purpose, her partner, and her peace. She had found in the most unexpected way and in the most unlikely place everything she had ever wanted and more than she had ever dared to hope for. The mountain man's gentle heart had found its perfect match in the widow's fierce courage, and together they had written a love story for the ages.